The year is 1603, and England holds its breath. In Richmond Palace, the last Tudor monarch lies dying, her face painted white with lead and vinegar, her red wig askew, her once commanding voice reduced to whispers. Elizabeth I, the Gloriana, who had ruled for 45 years, who had defeated the Spanish Armada and made England a power to be reckoned with, breathes her last on a cold March morning. With her dies an age, and with the dawn comes uncertainty that will shake the realm to its very foundations. The crown passes to a stranger, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, a man who speaks with an accent that sounds foreign in English ears, and carries ideas about royal authority that would have horrified the Iron Lady who preceded him. Where Elizabeth had danced delicately around the Commons' prerogatives while asserting her own, the new sovereign arrives from Edinburgh, convinced that rulers govern by divine appointment, accountable to God alone, and beholden to no earthly assembly. In the smoky taverns of London and the great halls of country estates, Englishmen who had grown comfortable with their peculiar balance of crown and commons watched this Scottish interloper with growing unease. The first Stuart speaks endlessly of his divine right to rule, as if God himself had whispered the secrets of statecraft into royal ears. Kings are justly called gods, he proclaims from his throne, for that they exercise a manner or resemblance of divine power upon earth. Such words fall strangely on English ears, accustomed to a different tradition, one where even queens must sometimes bend to the will of commons. But the first Stuart brings more than alien theories of governance. He carries with him the religious complexities of a Scotland torn between Presbyterian discipline and Catholic intrigue, and he finds himself thrust into an England where religious tensions simmer just beneath the surface of civil order. The Elizabethan settlement had created an uneasy peace between conforming Anglicans and dissenting Puritans, with Catholics driven underground but never entirely eliminated. The new sovereign, raised Presbyterian but crowned in Anglican ceremonies, understands neither the delicate balance his predecessor maintained, nor the passionate convictions that drive men to risk everything for matters of liturgy and doctrine. The religious landscape spreads before him like a map of competing loyalties. In cathedral closes and university halls, Anglican clergy defend their episcopal hierarchy and Book of Common Prayer against Puritan ministers who see bishops as popish corruption and written prayers as spiritual death. In hidden chapels and private homes, Catholic recusants maintain their ancient faith, despite fines that impoverish them and laws that treat their devotion as treason. Each group watches their new ruler carefully, hoping he will favor their interpretation of Christian truth, while fearing he will embrace their enemies' errors. That fear transforms into terror on a November night in 1605, when Guy Fawkes is discovered in the cellars beneath Westminster, with 36 barrels of gunpowder and a plan to blow Crown, Lords, and Commons into eternity. The gunpowder plot, as it becomes known to history, reveals the depths of Catholic desperation while igniting Protestant paranoia that will burn for generations. In market squares throughout the realm, effigies of the Pope burn alongside those of the would-be regicide, while ministers preach sermons that paint every Catholic as a potential assassin waiting for Rome's command to strike. James himself barely escapes the explosion that would have decapitated English government in a single blast. But the plot's discovery unleashes forces that prove almost as destructive as Fawkes's barrels might have been. Anti-Catholic hysteria spreads through England like plague through an overcrowded city, creating an atmosphere where religious differences become matters of national security and theological disputes take on the character of patriotic duty. The comfortable assumption that Englishmen of different faiths can coexist peacefully within a single kingdom begins to crumble under the weight of mutual suspicion and fear. Economic pressures compound these religious and political tensions, as James discovers that English kingship carries costs that Scottish revenues never prepared him to meet. The last Tudor had left the crown deep in debt despite her legendary parsimony, and James's generous nature, so different from Elizabeth's careful calculations, only worsens the financial crisis. Where the Virgin Queen had made virtue of necessity by turning stinginess into statecraft, James showers favourites with gifts the treasury cannot afford, while pursuing foreign policies that drain gold faster than taxation can replenish it. Parliament, traditionally called only when monarchs needed money, finds itself in the unprecedented position of being asked repeatedly for subsidies that exceed anything previous generations had imagined necessary. The members who gather in Westminster Hall listen politely to royal requests for revenue, while privately calculating whether their constituents can bear additional burdens for policies they neither understand nor support. The ancient contract between Crown and Commons, money granted in exchange for grievances addressed, begins to strain under pressures that neither side fully comprehends. James's solution to these mounting pressures reveals both his political inexperience and his fundamental misunderstanding of English governance. Rather than court Parliament through the patient negotiations that Elizabeth had mastered, he increasingly relies on royal prerogative to raise revenue through mechanisms that lawyers question and taxpayers resent. Impositions on trade, forced loans from wealthy subjects, and creative interpretations of feudal obligations provide short-term relief, while creating long-term constitutional crises that his successors will inherit. The king's personality, so different from the commanding presence his predecessor had projected, becomes itself a source of political weakness. Where Elizabeth had been imperious but impressive, James appears learned but awkward, more comfortable in scholarly disputation than royal ceremony. His slobbering speech, his fear of naked swords, his obvious affection for male favourites, all provide ammunition for critics who question whether this Scottish scholar possesses the gravitas that English kingship requires. Robert Carr and then George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, rise to positions of influence that scandalise a court accustomed to the careful distance Elizabeth had maintained from all her servants. Buckingham, in particular, becomes the lightning rod for growing discontent, a handsome opportunist whose rapid elevation from minor gentry to ducal grandeur epitomises everything that traditional England finds disturbing about the new reign. His monopoly of royal favour, his interference in government policy, his accumulation of offices and honours, all serve to focus opposition that might otherwise remain scattered among various grievances. When James dies in 1625, he bequeaths to his son Charles a kingdom more divided than it had been for generations. The new king inherits not merely a crown, but a collection of unresolved tensions that his father's reign has allowed to fester. Religious differences that Elizabeth had managed to contain through careful ambiguity have hardened into irreconcilable positions. Constitutional questions that the first Stuart had left unanswered now demand resolution. Financial problems that creative accounting had temporarily masked threaten to overwhelm royal administration. Charles I brings to these inherited challenges a personality even less suited to English political realities than his father's had been. Where James had been garrulous and undignified, but politically flexible, Charles is reserved and ceremonious, but utterly rigid in his convictions. He speaks with a stutter that makes public speaking an ordeal. Yet he believes absolutely in the dignity of kingship and the divine nature of royal authority. His marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess whose faith scandalizes Protestant England, demonstrates either remarkable political courage or breathtaking insensitivity to public opinion. The new queen brings with her not only personal devotion to Roman Catholicism, but a retinue of French priests and courtiers who seem to embody every English fear about foreign influence and papal intrigue. Her private chapel at Somerset House becomes a focal point for Catholic hopes and Protestant anxieties, a visible reminder that the king's own household harbours the faith that most of his subjects consider treasonous. When she refuses to attend Charles's coronation because Anglican ceremonies offend her conscience, even moderate Protestants begin to question whether this foreign queen can ever truly become English. Parliament's early encounters with the new king reveal the constitutional crisis that has been building throughout the Stuart period. When members gather for Charles's first session, they bring with them a decade of accumulated grievances against royal policies that seem to circumvent their traditional role in governance. The Petition of Right in 1628 attempts to restore what parliamentarians consider the ancient balance between royal prerogative and subject rights. But Charles's grudging acceptance of its terms satisfies no one while solving nothing. The king's financial needs, always pressing, become desperate as foreign policy commitments demand resources that traditional revenue sources cannot provide. His marriage treaty with France includes secret clauses promising relief for English Catholics, commitments that require military support for French policy that Parliament refuses to fund. When Charles attempts to honour these obligations through forced loans and arbitrary taxation, he triggers exactly the constitutional confrontation that wise policy would have avoided. The assassination of Buckingham in 1628 removes the most visible target of parliamentary anger, while changing nothing fundamental about the political crisis that continues to deepen. Charles mourns his favourite with genuine grief that reveals the isolation of a king who trusts no one as completely as he had trusted the Duke. But Buckingham's death also eliminates the last advisor, with enough influence to moderate royal policy when compromise becomes necessary. The king, left to his own judgment, chooses increasingly to rely on his own conscience rather than political calculation. The decision that will define the next decade emerges from Charles's conviction that he can govern England more effectively without Parliament's interference than with its obstruction. In 1629, after scenes of unprecedented tumult in the Commons' chamber, members holding the Speaker in his chair while they pass resolutions condemning royal policy, Charles dissolves Parliament and announces his intention to rule without it indefinitely. Thus begins what historians will call the 11 Years' Tyranny, though Charles himself sees it as 11 years of blessed relief from factious opposition that prevents good government. The king retreats into a world of court ceremony and artistic patronage, surrounding himself with the beauty and order that political life seems incapable of providing. Van Dyck's portraits capture this period's atmosphere, a monarch serene in his conviction that divine providence supports his rule, while shadows gather at the edges of the canvas that the artist's skill cannot entirely dispel. To govern without Parliament, Charles must raise revenue without parliamentary consent, a challenge that brings forth ingenious expedients whose legality proves as questionable as their effectiveness. Ship money, traditionally levied on coastal counties to support naval defence, extends throughout the realm as the king's lawyers discover precedents that justify extraordinary measures during extraordinary times. Forest laws dormant since medieval days awaken to generate fines from landowners whose estates encroach on boundaries that ancient charters supposedly established. Monopolies multiply as the crown sells exclusive trading privileges that enrich royal favourites while burdening consumers with higher prices. John Hampden, a Buckinghamshire gentleman of moderate means and radical principles, becomes the unlikely hero of constitutional resistance when he refuses to pay ship money on his modest estate. His case winds through courts where royal judges struggle to balance legal precedent against political necessity, ultimately ruling that the king's emergency powers justify taxation without parliamentary consent. But their narrow victory proves Pyrrhic, as Hampden's trial educates the entire kingdom in constitutional arguments that transform tax resistance from mere obstinacy into patriotic duty. Meanwhile, William Laud, elevated to Canterbury in 1633, pursues religious policies that seem designed to drive Puritans either into conformity or out of England entirely. His Beauty of Holiness campaign transforms parish churches throughout the realm, installing altar rails that separate communion tables from congregations, requiring ceremonies that Puritans consider popish superstition, and silencing ministers whose preaching emphasizes predestination over episcopal authority. Laud believes he is restoring ancient traditions that Protestant zealots have corrupted, but to Puritan eyes, he appears to be leading England back toward Roman bondage. The Archbishop's persecution of dissenting ministers creates a steady stream of emigrants sailing for Massachusetts Bay, where Puritan settlers build communities that embody the religious discipline that English authorities refuse to permit. John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill rises in New England soil, nourished by refugees from Laudian oppression, while those who remain in England either submit to ceremonies that violate their consciences or worship in secret conventicles that authorities treat as seditious assemblies. Charles's attempt to impose Anglican uniformity on Scotland proves the fatal miscalculation that destroys his personal rule. The Scottish Kirk, Presbyterian in organisation and Calvinist in doctrine, views episcopal authority as papal tyranny disguised in Protestant vestments. When Laud's liturgy arrives in Edinburgh, it triggers riots that spread throughout the lowlands as ordinary Scots defend their religious traditions against what they perceive as English cultural imperialism. The National Covenant of 1638 transforms religious protest into political resistance, as Scottish nobles, ministers, and commoners unite to defend their ancient liberties against innovations that threaten both kirk and kingdom. Their solemn league binds signatories to resist religious changes while maintaining loyalty to the crown, a distinction that Charles refuses to accept but cannot prevent. Scotland effectively declares independence in all but name, organising armies to defend decisions that Westminster has never authorised them to make. The bishops' wars that follow reveal the military weakness underlying Charles's political pretensions. English armies, hastily assembled and inadequately supplied, face Scottish forces fighting for principles they consider more precious than life itself. At Newburn in 1640, Scottish soldiers cross the Tyne and occupy Newcastle, humiliating royal forces while demanding tribute from English counties they now control. Charles, faced with military disaster and financial bankruptcy, finally acknowledges what his subjects have long understood. Personal rule has failed. The summons for a new parliament in November 1640 arrives like rain after drought, releasing pressures that 11 years of silence have allowed to accumulate. Members gathering in Westminster bring with them not merely immediate grievances, but a decade's worth of constitutional theory, refined through forced leisure and opposition debate. They have had years to consider what went wrong and how to prevent its recurrence, time to organize resistance and coordinate strategy. Yet as these men take their seats in St. Stephen's Chapel, few imagine they are beginning a revolution that will cost a king his head and transform the English constitution beyond recognition. They speak of restoring ancient liberties, not creating new forms of government. They invoke precedent and tradition, not innovation and experiment. Most still hope that firm measures will recall Charles to his duty rather than requiring his destruction. But the forces they represent have grown beyond anyone's capacity to control through mere adjustments and accommodations. Religious passion, constitutional principle, economic interest, and personal ambition combine in volatile mixtures that moderate leadership cannot safely contain. The storm that has been gathering since 1603 finally begins to break, and when it passes, neither England nor its king will ever be quite the same. In London's narrow streets, apprentices and merchants discuss ship money with the intensity that their grandfathers had reserved for foreign wars. In country parishes, yeomen and gentlemen debate episcopal authority, while their wives consider whether salvation requires separation from a corrupted church. Throughout the realm, ordinary people discover that political questions they had previously left to their betters now demand personal decisions that will shape their children's futures. The personal rule is ending, but the reckoning has only just begun. Charles sits in Whitehall, still convinced that divine providence supports his cause, while beyond the palace walls, his subjects prepare for confrontations that will test whether English liberty and royal authority can coexist within a single kingdom. The die is cast, though few yet realize it. The storm before the tempest has broken, and the real tempest now approaches with the inexorable force of destiny itself. November, mist rises from the Thames as members of Parliament gather for what they pray will be England's political salvation, unaware they are about to unleash forces that will sweep away not merely royal policies, but the very foundations of the world they have known. The revolution begins not with sword and fire, but with speeches and petitions, yet the outcome will prove no less transformative for its parliamentary origins. The age of absolutism dies in England before it can truly be born, killed by subjects who refuse to surrender liberties their ancestors won through centuries of struggle. What emerges from this death will be unprecedented in human history, a kingdom where power flows upward from popular consent rather than downward from divine appointment, where even kings must answer to laws they cannot change alone. The tempest awaits, gathering strength in the distance like summer thunder, promising storms that will cleanse the air while shaking the earth itself. November, mist clings to the Thames as members of the Long Parliament gather in Westminster, carrying with them 11 years of accumulated grievances and the pent-up fury of a nation denied its voice. They file into St. Stephen's Chapel like prisoners emerging from a long captivity, blinking in the unfamiliar light of restored power, while calculating how to ensure their jailers can never again lock the doors of representative government. This assembly, history will remember, convenes with powers that no previous legislative body has possessed and wrongs that no previous generation has been forced to endure. John Pym rises from the Middlesex benches with the bearing of a man called to divine judgment. For 2 decades, this Somerset lawyer has watched the monarchy drift toward tyranny, while dreaming of the moment when resistance might become reform. His lean face, carved by years of opposition planning, surveys colleagues who share his determination to ensure that personal rule dies not merely in practice but in possibility. The architect of the coming upheaval understands that this opportunity may never return. The flood of reform begins immediately, sweeping away the legal foundations of Stuart absolutism with systematic thoroughness that reveals how carefully opposition leaders have prepared for this moment. The Court of Star Chamber that engine of monarchical justice which had silenced critics and crushed nonconformists without jury trial, vanishes with a stroke of the legislative pen. The Court of High Commission, Lord's weapon against Puritan ministers, follows into oblivion. Ship money, forest fines, and all the creative taxation schemes that had funded 11 years of personal rule receive formal condemnation as violations of ancient liberties that no emergency can justify. Yet beneath this surface, unity, lurk divisions that will eventually tear the realm apart. Religious moderates who oppose Laudian innovations nevertheless fear Presbyterian discipline almost as much as popish ceremony. Political conservatives who support reasonable limits on monarchical power worry that excessive reform might encourage popular rebellion against all legitimate governance. Regional representatives who resent London's dominance discover that their grievances against the court do not automatically translate into agreement about alternative arrangements. Pym navigates these treacherous currents with political skill that transforms potential opposition into reluctant cooperation. His speeches invoke tradition rather than innovation, precedent rather than radical experiment. When he calls for the destruction of Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, he frames the demand not as revolutionary justice, but as ancient necessity. Strafford, recalled from Ireland to serve as the sovereign's chief minister, embodies everything that English liberty fears: arbitrary power clothed in legal forms, efficient government purchased at the price of fundamental rights. The great Earl's trial becomes a theatre where constitutional principles play out as intensely personal drama. Westminster Hall, that ancient seat of English justice, echoes with arguments that will determine whether governmental efficiency can justify arbitrary methods. Strafford, brilliant and supremely arrogant, defends his Irish administration with legal precision that reveals both his intellectual gifts and his profound moral blindness. He speaks eloquently of necessity and emergency, of royal prerogative and executive efficiency, marshalling historical precedents that would prove compelling if they did not threaten to justify tyranny in every corner of the realm. His correspondence, seized from royal archives by parliamentary investigators, reveals the true extent of his ambitions and the crown's secret intentions. Letters speak casually of using the Irish army to reduce this kingdom, meaning England itself, while others discuss importing foreign mercenaries to crush domestic opposition that threatens royal authority. The documentary evidence transforms what might have been merely political disagreement into something approaching high treason, though Strafford's defenders argue passionately that serving royal commands cannot constitute rebellion against royal authority. For 3 weeks, the greatest legal minds in England debate whether a minister's undeniable efficiency can outweigh his method's patent arbitrariness. Strafford's defense, conducted with the formidable skill that had made him indispensable to royal government, demonstrates conclusively that every controversial measure he had taken possessed some legal justification, however strained or creative. Yet Pym and his parliamentary colleagues understand that legal technicalities matter far less than political necessities. If Strafford lives, he will certainly counsel the Crown toward policies that make constitutional government impossible. When legal conviction proves frustratingly difficult, despite overwhelming evidence of tyrannical intent, Pym shifts tactics with ruthless pragmatism that reveals how far parliamentary opposition has travelled from mere constitutional reform. If Strafford cannot be condemned as a criminal under existing law, he must die as a public danger under legislative authority that transcends ordinary legal procedures. The Bill of Attainder that destroys Wentworth requires no proof of specific crimes, only legislative determination that his continued existence threatens the Commonwealth's survival. The precedent chills even those who vote for it, establishing that extraordinary times may require extraordinary measures that ordinary law cannot provide. When the royal favourite walks to his execution on Tower Hill in May 1641, he carries with him not merely his own life, but the ancient principle that royal servants enjoy immunity from parliamentary justice. His death teaches lessons that both sides absorb with uncomfortable clarity. Constitutional resistance can destroy even the most powerful ministers when theory aligns with popular fury, while political disagreement can escalate into personal destruction when moderate voices lose control of revolutionary events. Ireland erupts into rebellion, just as Westminster congratulates itself on restoring English liberties, transforming constitutional crisis into military emergency with devastating suddenness. The October massacres that sweep through Ulster catch Protestant settlers completely unprepared, as Catholic insurgents settle scores accumulated through decades of plantation and systematic dispossession. In county after county, Protestant families who had built prosperous farms on confiscated Catholic lands discover that their neighbours' resentment runs deeper than any legal title can secure. Those who had prospered through the systematic displacement of native Irish now find themselves fleeing for their lives as rebellion spreads like wildfire through the northern counties. The reports that reach London grow more horrifying with each courier's arrival, though English imagination multiplies the actual casualties into systematic genocide that confirms every anti-Catholic prejudice harboured since the Reformation. Stories spread of pregnant women disemboweled, children roasted alive, ministers tortured for mere sport, atrocities that may have occurred in isolated instances, but that Protestant propaganda transforms into universal Catholic policy. The rebellion's timing seems too convenient to be merely coincidental, leading many to suspect that royal agents have secretly encouraged Irish Catholics to provide the military crisis that might justify renewed royal authoritarianism. Yet the reality proves complex enough without elaborate conspiracy theories. Irish Catholics, watching English Protestants tear each other apart over constitutional questions, quite reasonably conclude that this moment offers their best opportunity in generations to reclaim lands and liberties that English colonization has systematically destroyed. The confederation that emerges from the rebellion creates an alternative Irish government controlling most of the island while maintaining nominal loyalty to the crown, a fine distinction that satisfies no one while threatening everyone who must deal with its practical implications. English responses to Irish rebellion reveal the religious and racial prejudices that complicate every aspect of the developing constitutional crisis. Parliamentary Puritans who champion liberty for English Protestants show remarkably little concern for Irish Catholic rights, while royal supporters who defend traditional authority prove equally willing to exploit Irish rebellion as justification for arbitrary measures. Both sides compete zealously to appear more committed to Protestant interests, while privately calculating how Irish developments might serve their immediate domestic political needs. The Irish crisis forces Westminster to confront the fundamental question that constitutional theory has thus far carefully avoided. Who commands England's military forces when Crown and Commons disagree fundamentally about their proper use? Traditional law grants the sovereign exclusive authority over armed forces, but traditional practice has always assumed that royal policy serves genuine national interests rather than narrow personal ambition. When members debate whether to grant military authority for Irish suppression, they discover that constitutional precedent provides no clear guidance for situations where loyalty to the crown conflicts directly with loyalty to the realm. Pym seizes this crucial moment to present his masterwork of opposition propaganda, the Grand Remonstrance, a comprehensive indictment of royal policy since the accession of the first Stuart 4 decades earlier. The massive document catalogues systematically every grievance that 38 years of alleged misgovernment have accumulated, from the first James's notorious favoritism through his son's 11 years of personal rule to the present crisis that threatens to engulf the entire kingdom in religious warfare. More importantly, it demands parliamentary control over military appointments and royal councillors, effectively requiring the sovereign to govern through ministers whom Commons explicitly approves. The debates over this revolutionary document reveal how far English politics has travelled from the deferential relationships that previous generations had simply taken for granted. Members who had once spoken respectfully of royal prerogative now question openly whether any single individual possesses wisdom sufficient to govern without serious institutional constraints. Religious discussions that had previously focused on relatively minor ceremonial details now address fundamental questions about the proper relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Constitutional arguments that had once turned primarily on legal precedent increasingly invoke natural rights that supposedly transcend all historical arrangements. The remonstrance passes by a mere 11 votes after debates that stretch deep into November nights, with exhausted members arguing by flickering candlelight, while London apprentices crowd the corridors outside, demanding immediate action against alleged popish plotters. The devastatingly narrow margin reveals how evenly the kingdom now divides between those who believe reform has already gone far enough and those who insist it has barely begun. Moderate voices that might have bridged these dangerous differences find themselves systematically shouted down by extremists who see any compromise as outright betrayal and reasonable accommodation as craven surrender. The royal response demonstrates either remarkable personal courage or truly catastrophic political misjudgment. Rather than accept reasonable limits on royal authority that might preserve the essential substance of monarchical power, the sovereign chooses direct confrontation that risks absolutely everything on a single desperate gamble. His attempt to arrest 5 leading members of the Commons in January 1642 transforms abstract constitutional disagreement into intensely personal conflict, creating the dramatic moment that makes peaceful resolution utterly impossible. The scene in St. Stephen's Chapel on that fateful January afternoon captures the revolution's essential character in a single moment of high political theatre that will echo through centuries of constitutional development. The sovereign enters the Commons chamber in person, a violation of parliamentary privilege so unprecedented that even committed royal supporters gasp audibly in shock. His physical presence transforms the sacred space where representatives of the realm normally deliberate into something resembling a royal court, where humble subjects await their master's pleasure. Armed guards wait menacingly outside the chamber doors, their polished steel gleaming in pale winter light that streams through ancient windows, while members sit frozen in their places as history pivots dramatically on a moment's unfolding drama. The monarch approaches the speaker's chair with the measured step of a man who sincerely believes divine providence guides his every action. William Lenthall, that respected lawyer from Oxfordshire, whose family has faithfully served Commons for generations, faces a choice that will define parliamentary independence for all future ages. When the Crown formally demands surrender of the 5 members whom royal authority has accused of high treason, the Speaker must decide whether his ultimate loyalty belongs to the sovereign who had appointed him or to the assembly that has entrusted him with their most sacred proceedings. Lenthall's response becomes the constitutional revolution's founding scripture, words that will be memorized by every future defender of parliamentary government. May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. The carefully chosen words, delivered with quiet dignity that masks their truly revolutionary implications, establish definitively that parliamentary officers serve the institution rather than the crown, that representative government possesses its own independent authority, regardless of royal pleasure or displeasure. The sovereign's humiliation completes itself when he discovers that his intended victims have already fled, warned by loyal supporters who absolutely refuse to see parliamentary leaders treated as common criminals. I see all the birds are flown, he mutters bitterly, the seemingly casual words carrying symbolic weight that contemporaries immediately understand. Royal authority has suffered a devastating blow that mere political compromise can never heal, while parliamentary privilege has received recognition that transforms it from procedural courtesy into fundamental constitutional principle. The metaphor proves remarkably prophetic. The birds of parliamentary liberty, once freed from their royal cages, will never again accept captivity. The attempted arrest destroys whatever fragile trust might have survived 11 years of personal rule and 18 months of increasingly radical reform legislation. Members who had previously harbored genuine hopes for reasonable accommodation now prepare grimly for armed resistance, while committed supporters of royal prerogative discover that their sovereign's political judgment simply cannot be trusted with their own personal safety. The constitutional monarchy that moderate reformers had carefully envisioned requires mutual confidence that royal actions have now made completely impossible. Both sides begin preparing systematically for the military conflict that political means can evidently no longer prevent. The Militia Ordinance, passed defiantly without royal consent in March 1642, claims unprecedented parliamentary authority to appoint military commanders for the realm's defence. The Crown responds with ancient commissions of array that invoke traditional feudal obligations to raise armed forces loyal to royal rather than parliamentary authority. Each side formally accuses the other of dangerous innovation against established law while claiming to defend authentic constitutional tradition. The painful choice of sides reveals profound social and geographical divisions that had previously remained hidden beneath England's deceptive political unity. The North and West, where traditional social relationships retain their ancient strength and episcopal authority, still commands widespread respect, generally support the Crown's claims against parliamentary innovation. Here, in isolated manor houses and conservative market towns, the old world stubbornly persists. Dependent tenants who rely on landlord protection, traditional craftsmen whose guilds maintain medieval hierarchies, established clergy whose comfortable livings derive from ancient endowments. These communities see parliamentary resistance as dangerous experimentation that threatens stable relationships carefully built over many generations. The South and East, where dynamic commercial relationships have significantly weakened feudal bonds, and Puritan preaching has successfully challenged religious hierarchy, mostly embrace parliamentary resistance to alleged royal tyranny. London's wealthy merchants, Bristol's cloth traders, Norwich's innovative manufacturers, these men have built substantial fortunes through individual initiative rather than inherited privilege. Their accumulated wealth depends critically on legal protections that arbitrary government directly threatens, while their religious convictions emphasize personal relationship with divine authority over institutional mediation. For them, parliamentary supremacy represents not dangerous innovation, but absolutely necessary defense of liberties that successful economic development requires. Yet these broad social patterns contain numerous striking exceptions that demonstrate how personal loyalty, immediate local circumstances, and individual conscience complicate any simple analysis of the conflict's underlying social meaning. In Yorkshire, Sir Thomas Fairfax chooses Parliament, while most of his neighbours enthusiastically support the Crown, dividing an entire county between competing loyalties that will soon produce competing armies. Throughout England, ancient noble families split bitterly between Crown and Commons, as sons choose very differently than their fathers, while brothers find themselves on opposite sides of constitutional questions that neither generation has previously faced. Women throughout the realm face particularly complex and painful choices, as traditional authority structures crumble around them with frightening speed. Those whose husbands and fathers support the Crown discover that political loyalty may require managing extensive estates and complex businesses, while male relatives serve in royal armies far from home. Parliamentary supporters must consider seriously whether political resistance justifies the inevitable social upheaval that extended military conflict will certainly bring to their communities. Some embrace eagerly the expanded opportunities that national crisis creates, while others retreat into intensely private religion that promises spiritual security regardless of uncertain political outcomes. Economic pressures create their own distinct opportunities and dangerous complications as both sides prepare for extended conflict. London's great merchants, who depend absolutely on parliamentary protection for their valuable commercial privileges, generally support Commons against Crown, despite their obvious preference for stability over confrontation. Country gentlemen, whose landed estates provide the essential economic foundation for their political independence, must calculate carefully whether parliamentary taxation or potential royal confiscation poses the greater long-term threat to their family prosperity. Yeoman farmers and skilled urban artisans who possess just enough property to fear its possible loss find themselves actively courted by both sides, while wondering whether political revolution will ultimately improve or completely destroy their modest security. The role of England's clergy becomes absolutely crucial, as both sides desperately seek divine authorization for what clearly amounts to civil war between fellow Christians. Episcopal ministers generally counsel patient obedience to established royal authority as an essential part of their sacred duty to support religious order, though some privately sympathize with moderate parliamentary reform. Puritan preachers increasingly identify the royal cause with dangerous popish corruption, while presenting parliamentary resistance as absolutely necessary defense of true Protestant religion. The pulpits of England effectively become recruiting stations where sophisticated theological arguments gradually transform into practical political mobilization. Scotland's complex position adds yet another layer of dangerous uncertainty to an already impossibly tangled situation. The national covenant that had originally sparked the costly bishops' wars now makes Scottish Presbyterians natural allies of English Puritans, but meaningful alliance requires detailed agreements about religious settlement that neither side has yet achieved internally. The solemn league and covenant that eventually formalizes this crucial partnership commits Parliament explicitly to Presbyterian church government throughout England in exchange for desperately needed Scottish military support, a sweeping promise that moderate members accept only reluctantly, while radical independents reject entirely. By late summer 1642, political positions have hardened completely into military preparations that make armed conflict virtually inevitable. The sovereign establishes his court first at York, then moves to historic Nottingham, where ancient precedent suggests royal standards should properly be raised when domestic enemies threaten the realm's security. Parliament remains firmly entrenched in London, protected by increasingly well-organized citizen militias and supported by the commercial wealth that can finance extended resistance. Neither side commands sufficient immediate force to overwhelm the other quickly, ensuring that any resulting conflict will prove both prolonged and devastating. Final attempts at negotiation reveal how completely mutual trust has broken down between Crown and Commons after months of escalating confrontation. Parliamentary commissioners who travel north to meet the sovereign at York discover that even personal conversations cannot possibly bridge disagreements now rooted in fundamentally incompatible theories of government. Royal offers of limited compromise satisfy absolutely no one, while convincing both sides that their opponents negotiate in complete bad faith. The 19 propositions that Parliament formally presents as non-negotiable terms for peaceful settlement effectively demand royal acceptance of constitutional monarchy so complete that traditional prerogative would disappear entirely. On August 22nd, 1642, the royal standard rises ceremoniously over Nottingham Castle in a formal ceremony that officially begins the English Civil War. The sovereign's proclamation speaks stirringly of defending ancient laws against dangerous parliamentary innovation, while calling upon all loyal subjects to rally immediately to their rightful monarch's threatened cause. Parliament's defiant response declares that royal policies threaten the fundamental liberties that make English freedom possible, while summoning the realm's true defenders to preserve constitutional government against arbitrary power that threatens everyone's security. Neither side yet fully understands the terrible forces they have now unleashed, or the comprehensive destruction that inevitably follows when political disagreement escalates into sustained military conflict between neighbours. The war that begins with elaborate ceremonies and formal proclamations will soon consume the precious lives of family members, lifelong friends, and trusted neighbours who discover that abstract constitutional principles require concrete choices between competing loyalties that tear communities apart. England enters a devastating decade of revolution that will test definitively whether any kingdom can survive when its people disagree fundamentally about the proper relationship between legitimate authority and individual liberty. The slide into war reaches its seemingly inevitable conclusion as autumn winds scatter the dead leaves around Nottingham's ancient stone walls. The constitutional crisis that had begun with Scottish resistance to religious innovation has now become English civil war over political revolution that threatens to destroy the realm entirely. What had started hopefully as modest reform has become dangerous rebellion. What had begun as principled resistance has become complete revolution. The kingdom that had seemed so remarkably stable under Elizabeth's long rule now fragments into competing armies, led by sincere men who pray earnestly to the same God, while preparing to kill each other for utterly incompatible visions of how divine will should govern earthly kingdoms. The die is cast, the Rubicon definitively crossed, the point of no return forever past. England begins its great and terrible experiment in revolutionary government, while the Crown prepares its determined counter-revolution to restore traditional authority that has sustained the realm for centuries. Blood will soon flow freely in English fields, as Englishmen discover that some fundamental differences simply cannot be compromised away, but must be settled through the harsh arbitration of sword and musket, pike and cannon. The storm has finally broken in all its fury, and only complete victory can possibly bring the blessed sunshine of lasting peace. August winds scatter the dying leaves around Nottingham Castle, as the sovereign's standard snaps defiantly against an iron-grey sky. The ceremony marking the formal beginning of hostilities carries all the pageantry that tradition demands, yet something hollow echoes in the herald's proclamation, calling loyal subjects to their monarch's defense. Both sides understand that this ritual merely acknowledges what everyone already knows. England has begun the bloody work of tearing itself apart, brother against brother, neighbour against neighbour, in a conflict that will test whether a kingdom can survive when its people disagree about the very nature of legitimate government. The armies that gather in those first autumn months resemble nothing so much as armed philosophical debates given physical form. Neither faction possesses professional forces adequate for sustained warfare, relying instead on hastily recruited militia whose enthusiasm far exceeds their training. Country gentlemen who have read classical histories of ancient battles discover that Plutarch's tactics translate poorly to English fields, while yeoman farmers and village craftsmen who expected brief service find themselves committed to struggles that will consume years of their lives and transform their understanding of what it means to be English. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, leads Westminster's forces southward from London with the ponderous dignity of a man convinced he serves ancient liberties against recent tyrannies. His host carries banners proclaiming, "For God and the laws," words that capture the moderate hopes of legislators who still pray that firm action will recall their sovereign to constitutional duty rather than require his destruction. These men march not as rebels, but as loyal subjects defending traditional rights against arbitrary innovations that threaten the foundations of English freedom. Robert Bertie, Earl of Lindsey, commands the monarchist forces with equal conviction that divine providence supports his cause against seditious subjects who cloak rebellion in legal rhetoric. His soldiers wear badges declaring loyalty to the true Protestant religion, the laws of the land, the liberty of the subject, and the privilege of Westminster. A formulation so similar to their enemy's motto that casual observers might wonder what fundamental principle actually divides these armies, preparing to shed each other's blood across the familiar landscapes of their shared homeland. Both commanders quickly discover that raising troops proves far easier than controlling them once battle approaches. The gentlemen volunteers who provide officer leadership bring courage and social authority, but little practical experience of military command under fire. The farmers and artisans who fill the ranks possess individual bravery, but lack the collective discipline that transforms civilian crowds into effective fighting units. Most sobering of all, the financial resources needed to sustain extended campaigns simply do not exist in quantities adequate for either side's ambitions. The first major test of strength comes at Edgehill on October 23rd, near the Warwickshire village of Kinnerton, where amateur enthusiasm meets the harsh realities of organised violence. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the sovereign's nephew and veteran of European wars, leads the royalist cavalry in a charge that epitomizes both the magnificence and the tactical limitations of aristocratic warfare. His horsemen scatter Essex's opposing cavalry with contemptuous ease, but their pursuit of fleeing enemies extends far beyond any strategic necessity, opening dangerous gaps in the loyalist line. The prince brings continental expertise to English battlefields, unprepared for professional warfare, yet his men fight more like gentlemen pursuing stags than soldiers executing coordinated tactics. They possess superb individual horsemanship, learned in hunting fields and sporting contests, but they lack the disciplined formations that transform cavalry charges from glorious gestures into decisive battlefield instruments. Victory in individual combat means nothing if it sacrifices collective advantage to personal glory. Meanwhile, the infantry formations crash together in a confused melee where personal courage matters more than tactical sophistication, where ancient grudges between neighbouring families explode into mortal combat fought with pike and sword. Sir Edmund Verney, the sovereign's standard-bearer and childhood companion, dies defending the colours he has carried through decades of peaceful court ceremonies. His death symbolizes the transformation of political pageantry into fraternal slaughter, of abstract constitutional theory into concrete choices between life and death. Common soldiers from both armies discover that ideological conviction provides cold comfort when steel meets flesh, when neighbours they have known since childhood become enemies. They must kill or be killed by. The wounded and dying, scattered across Kinnerton's fields by evening, represent more than tactical failure. They embody the collapse of assumptions about English exceptionalism, about the possibility of resolving fundamental disagreements through civilized negotiation rather than barbarous warfare. The battle's inconclusive outcome frustrates commanders who had expected decisive victory to settle political questions that months of debate could not resolve. Neither side can claim triumph, despite casualties that shock a nation unaccustomed to such bloodshed between fellow subjects. The strategic situation favours Westminster forces, whose London base provides financial resources so that provincial strongholds cannot match. But immediate tactical success eludes both armies as they withdraw to lick their wounds while planning future campaigns. London's wealth, its control of customs revenues, and its access to international credit create advantages that all the sovereign's rural supporters cannot overcome through enthusiasm alone. More importantly, the capital's apprentices and merchants possess political consciousness that transforms military service from feudal obligation into ideological commitment. When these citizen soldiers march to confront royal forces at Turnham Green, they understand exactly what they fight to preserve: commercial privileges and religious freedoms that arbitrary government threatens to destroy. The conflict's regional character becomes apparent as local grievances merge with national issues to create a patchwork of separate struggles, nominally united under competing banners. In Yorkshire, the Fairfax family wages private war against neighbours whose political loyalties differ from their own, turning familiar countryside into contested territory where family relationships determine military allegiances. The West Country divides between clothing towns, where Puritan merchants support Westminster, and agricultural districts where traditional hierarchies favour the throne, creating a geographic pattern that reflects deeper social and economic divisions. Each county develops its own version of the larger struggle, fought with the peculiar intensity that only civil war between neighbours can generate. Ancient boundary disputes become military objectives. Personal slights transform into strategic considerations, and religious differences that had once coexisted uneasily within shared communities explode into mutual accusations of heresy and treason. The war becomes simultaneously national and intensely local, a conflict over abstract principles that plays out through the most concrete personal relationships. Religious passion adds cosmic dimensions to political disagreement, transforming disputes about governmental authority into struggles between divine and satanic forces that admit no compromise or accommodation. Puritan preachers identify the sovereign's cause with popish corruption, while presenting their own resistance as necessary defense of true Protestant faith against Antichrist's final assault. Episcopal ministers respond by condemning rebellion against divinely appointed rulers, while questioning whether subjects can serve God by defying his earthly representative. Every skirmish becomes a theological judgment, every victory proof of divine favor, every defeat evidence of insufficient faith or hidden sin. Soldiers pray before battles with the same intensity they bring to combat, understanding their service as spiritual calling rather than mere political obligation. This fusion of material and spiritual purposes creates motivation that transcends immediate tactical considerations, while making negotiated settlement increasingly difficult to achieve. The role of common soldiers evolves as initial enthusiasm encounters the harsh realities of extended military service that disrupts every aspect of civilian life. Men who enlisted expecting brief campaigns discover that war requires abandoning families and livelihoods for indefinite periods without adequate compensation or clear prospects for return. Desertion rates climb steadily as harvest seasons arrive, and troops must choose between military duty and economic survival, between abstract political principles and immediate family needs. Both sides struggle to maintain forces whose voluntary character makes traditional military discipline impossible to enforce consistently. Officers cannot simply execute deserters when their authority rests on popular consent rather than royal commission. Soldiers who serve from conviction rather than compulsion require different motivational techniques than professional armies employ, creating organizational challenges that neither side initially anticipates or adequately addresses. Oliver Cromwell emerges from this chaos as the conflict's most innovative commander, though few recognize his genius during these early campaigns when his methods seem eccentric compared to conventional military wisdom. The Huntingdon gentleman brings to warfare the same methodical approach that has made him successful in farming and local governance. Understanding that amateur armies require different leadership techniques than professional forces trained from childhood for military service. Where aristocratic officers rely on inherited authority and traditional deference, Cromwell creates discipline through shared religious conviction and demonstrated competence. Where conventional cavalry charges with magnificent disorder that prioritizes individual glory over collective effectiveness, his Ironsides advance in coordinated formations that maintain tactical coherence regardless of battlefield conditions. His innovations reflect deeper understanding of the social revolution that civil conflict has unleashed throughout English society. The transformation begins in the fenlands of eastern England, where Cromwell recruits yeoman farmers and village craftsmen who understand mechanical precision better than most gentlemen comprehend military strategy. These men, raised in communities where Puritan preaching emphasizes individual responsibility within collective discipline, prove remarkably adaptable to tactical methods that emphasize coordination over heroism. They drill with the same methodical attention to detail they bring to agricultural work, understanding that survival depends on mutual support rather than personal courage. Cromwell's troopers pray before engagements with the same intensity they bring to combat, singing psalms while advancing against enemies they identify with biblical oppressors. This religious dimension proves as significant as tactical innovation, creating esprit de corps that aristocratic commanders cannot replicate through traditional appeals to honor and social obligation. The fusion of spiritual and material purposes transforms individual fear into collective determination, while providing motivation that transcends immediate political considerations. The new model army, created by Westminster Ordinance in 1645, represents the logical culmination of lessons learned through 3 years of amateur warfare that has gradually evolved toward professional competence. Sir Thomas Fairfax's appointment as Commander-in-Chief brings systematic organization to forces that have suffered too often from incompetent leadership, based on social rank rather than military ability. The self-denying ordinance removes members of both houses from active command, eliminating political considerations that have prevented effective strategic coordination between competing parliamentary factions. Most importantly, the army's financing through systematic taxation rather than voluntary contributions creates the economic foundation that sustained military operations require. Previous forces had dissolved when money ran out, or when local communities could no longer support troops quartered indefinitely in their neighborhoods. Regular pay and organized supply systems allow commanders to plan extended campaigns while maintaining discipline among soldiers who no longer need to live off the countryside like organized bandits. This transformation reflects broader radicalization that prolonged conflict has produced throughout Westminster-controlled territory. As moderate reformers discover that war requires revolutionary methods to achieve even conservative goals, traditional deference to social hierarchy weakens when common soldiers prove more effective than gentleman officers, appointed through birth rather than merit. Religious toleration expands when military necessity requires cooperation between different Protestant denominations that had previously viewed each other with suspicion. Economic innovation accelerates when political survival depends on mobilizing resources more efficiently than enemies can manage, creating precedents for commercial and industrial development that will outlast the immediate military crisis. The army's social composition changes as extended conflict eliminates gentlemen volunteers, while attracting professional soldiers who view military service as permanent career rather than temporary civic obligation. These men develop corporate identity that transcends regional loyalties, religious affiliations, and traditional social backgrounds. They share hardships that aristocratic officers never experience, participate in victories that gentlemen volunteers cannot claim exclusive credit for, and develop political insights that customary deference has previously discouraged. Most dangerously for existing social arrangements, they begin questioning why birth should determine authority when demonstrated competence provides better results in matters of life and death that test human capabilities under extreme pressure. Marston Moor, fought on July 2nd, 1644, demonstrates the new model concept's potential while revealing coalition tensions that complicate Westminster's strategic position. The alliance with Scottish Presbyterians provides essential reinforcements for victory, but creates religious obligations that threaten to divide English Protestants along denominational lines that had been temporarily obscured by shared opposition to episcopal authority and royal supremacy. The battle unfolds across Yorkshire countryside, like a vast experiment in international cooperation, with English independents fighting alongside Scottish Presbyterians, while both groups eye each other with theological suspicion that military necessity cannot entirely suppress. The Scots bring disciplined formations learned during European campaigns, veterans of the 30 Years' War, who understand professional warfare better than most English gentlemen educated in classical literature rather than practical military science. Yet Scottish rigid adherence to Presbyterian church government conflicts with the religious flexibility that English conditions seem to require, creating tensions that will eventually fracture the victorious coalition. Prince Rupert's attempt to repeat his Edgehill success encounters very different opposition on Marston Moor, facing coordinated formations that maintain tactical coherence throughout the engagement, rather than scattered amateur horsemen easily broken by determined charges. Cromwell's Eastern Association cavalry, fighting alongside David Leslie's Scottish dragoons, demonstrates how religious conviction can substitute for aristocratic leadership when properly organized and systematically trained. The engagement's aftermath transforms the strategic balance by eliminating royalist control over northern England, while proving that Westminster forces can defeat professional armies when adequately led and equipped, rather than hampered by incompetent commanders appointed for political rather than military reasons. Prince Rupert's defeat shatters the royalist cavalry's reputation for invincibility, while establishing the principle that enthusiastic amateurs can evolve into disciplined soldiers given adequate time and proper training. More significantly, The victory advances Cromwell's political influence within Westminster circles, previously dominated by social superiors, who had viewed military service as gentlemen's recreation rather than serious profession, requiring specialized knowledge and systematic preparation. Yet victory creates new problems as quickly as it solves old ones. As the Scottish alliance that proved essential for battlefield success begins generating political complications that threaten to divide the victorious coalition along religious lines. Presbyterian demands for uniform church government throughout both kingdoms conflict with independent preferences for congregational autonomy that reflects local circumstances and individual conscience rather than centralized ecclesiastical authority. Nasibi fought on June 14th, 1645, effectively ends the First Civil War by destroying the sovereign's last effective army, while revealing how completely military dynamics have shifted since the amateur campaigns of 1642. Fairfax's tactical coordination reduces royalist forces to scattered remnants incapable of sustained resistance, while systematic pursuit prevents the kind of recovery that had allowed earlier defeats to be overcome through renewed recruitment and foreign assistance. The capture of the monarchist correspondence proves particularly damaging because the documents reveal extensive negotiations with foreign Catholic powers that contradict public protestations of Protestant loyalty. These papers provide Westminster with propaganda advantages that discredit moderate royalists who might otherwise support negotiated settlement, transforming what could have been political disagreement into apparent treason against national interests and religious identity. When published throughout Westminster territory, the letters eliminate whatever remaining trust might have survived years of mutual recrimination and military conflict. Secret promises to Irish Catholics and continental monarchs expose the extent to which desperate circumstances have driven the sovereign toward alliances that his own supporters find politically and religiously objectionable, undermining claims that resistance to royal authority constitutes rebellion against legitimate government. Siege warfare assumes increasing importance as the conflict evolves from amateur enthusiasm toward professional competence, with traditional castles and hastily fortified towns becoming strategic objectives whose capture or defense determines regional control. The techniques of systematic investment, artillery bombardment, and coordinated assault gradually replace the cavalry charges and pike formations that characterized earlier engagements, requiring engineering skills that prove as valuable as personal courage. Logistical organization matters more than individual heroism, as armies learn to sustain extended operations through careful planning rather than improvised expedients. The ability to maintain supply lines, coordinate between different military units, and adapt tactics to local conditions becomes more important than the kind of aristocratic leadership that had dominated earlier phases of the conflict, when warfare resembled enlarged sporting contests more than systematic political instruments. The social impact of prolonged warfare extends far beyond immediate military casualties to reshape relationships throughout English society in ways that peacetime politics could never have achieved. Women assume responsibilities previously reserved for men as husbands and fathers serve in distant armies, managing estates and businesses while making decisions that determine family survival in an economy disrupted by military demands and political uncertainty. Lucy Hutchinson manages her husband's Nottinghamshire properties while he serves in Westminster forces, discovering administrative capabilities that traditional gender roles had never allowed her to develop. In London, merchant wives organize networks that supply armies with equipment, food, and intelligence while maintaining commercial operations that fund continued resistance against royalist attempts to strangle the capital's economy through blockade and intimidation. Their activities create precedents for female participation in public affairs that extend far beyond immediate wartime necessities, demonstrating capabilities that peacetime social arrangements had systematically discouraged. Dorothy Osborne writes letters that circulate political information between Westminster supporters scattered throughout the countryside, while Lady Brilliana Harley defends Brampton Bryan Castle against royalist siege through personal courage and tactical skill that rival any male commander's achievements. Rural communities face different but equally transformative pressures as competing armies demand supplies, transportation, and occasional forced relocations that disrupt traditional agricultural patterns built up over generations of gradual adaptation to local conditions. Farmers must calculate not merely which crops will feed their families, but which political allegiances will protect their harvests from confiscation by hostile forces that treat enemy territory as legitimate source of military supplies. Village communities that had maintained stability for generations find themselves divided by loyalties that turn neighbors into enemies and transform familiar landscapes into contested battlefields where childhood friends become mortal opponents. The economic disruptions create opportunities for social advancement that peacetime hierarchies would have prevented indefinitely, as blacksmiths who manufacture weapons for local forces accumulate wealth that elevates their families above traditional stations. Merchants who organize supply chains for distant armies develop commercial networks that survive the immediate conflicts while providing foundations for expanded trade relationships that will reshape English commerce for generations. Even common soldiers who demonstrate leadership abilities find themselves promoted to positions that birth alone would never have granted, creating precedents for merit-based advancement that challenge fundamental assumptions about social organization. Religious developments during these years prove equally transformative as military necessity breaks down barriers between different Protestant denominations, while creating space for theological innovation that established church hierarchies had previously suppressed. Independent congregations multiply throughout areas under Westminster control, developing democratic practices that influence political as well as spiritual life through emphasis on individual conscience and collective decision-making. Sectarian differences that had once seemed absolute begin yielding to shared opposition against episcopal authority and royal supremacy, though theological disputes continue to generate tensions that will eventually fracture the parliamentary coalition. The religious landscape fragments into dozens of competing movements, united primarily by rejection of traditional hierarchical arrangements, rather than positive agreement about alternative organizational structures. Economic innovations, accelerated by wartime necessities, permanently alter English commercial relationships, while demonstrating possibilities that peacetime conservatism had systematically prevented. New taxation methods develop to finance military operations, while creating precedents for systematic revenue collection that will outlast the immediate crisis. Banking techniques expand to handle complex financial transactions that armies require, while industrial production adapts to military needs while developing capacity that will serve peacetime purposes. Most significantly, traditional restrictions on economic activity weaken when political survival requires maximizing resource mobilization, regardless of customary limitations on trade, manufacturing, and financial innovation. The conflict forces experimentation with commercial and industrial methods that established interests had previously blocked through political influence and social pressure, creating economic precedents that will prove irreversible. International dimensions become increasingly apparent as both sides seek foreign assistance, while continental powers calculate how English developments serve their strategic interests rather than ideological preferences. French support for Westminster forces reflects traditional hostility toward Habsburg influence, rather than genuine sympathy for representative government, while Spanish assistance to royalist causes aims to weaken English naval competition, rather than defend abstract monarchical principles. Dutch involvement follows commercial rather than ideological considerations, supporting whichever side offers better trading opportunities, rather than the faction whose political principles most closely align with Dutch republican traditions. These foreign complications create domestic problems for both English factions, as their supporters question whether patriotic causes should depend on alien assistance that compromises claims to religious and national purity. Westminster propagandists struggle to explain French Catholic aid while maintaining Protestant credentials that form the basis of their popular appeal, while royalist supporters find Spanish connections equally embarrassing when opponents publicize evidence of dependence on traditional enemies. Both sides discover that international alliances necessary for military success complicate domestic politics in ways that purely English conflicts would avoid, forcing choices between tactical advantage and ideological consistency. By 1646, the First Civil War approaches its conclusion not through single decisive battle, but through accumulated exhaustion that leaves royalist forces incapable of continued effective resistance. The sovereign's surrender to Scottish forces reflects desperation rather than strategic calculation. Yet even defeat provides opportunities for political manipulation that outright military victory might not have offered to a monarch whose personal charm and political skill remain formidable despite tactical setbacks. His Scottish captivity begins the complex negotiations that will dominate the next phase of revolutionary development, while demonstrating that civil wars end through political arrangements rather than purely military outcomes. The transformation that 4 years of warfare have produced extends far beyond immediate military results to reshape English society in ways that peacetime politics could never have achieved through gradual reform and voluntary accommodation. Traditional social hierarchies have weakened under pressures that make demonstrated merit more valuable than inherited status, while religious uniformity has yielded to denominational diversity that reflects theological competition rather than state enforcement. Economic relationships have evolved to serve wartime necessities while creating precedents for commercial innovation that will outlast the immediate crisis, and political consciousness has expanded to include social groups previously excluded from meaningful participation in governmental decisions. Most fundamentally, the experience of successful resistance to established authority has educated thousands of ordinary citizens in political possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. They have learned that governmental power depends on popular consent rather than divine appointment, that social arrangements serve human purposes rather than natural law, and that political institutions can be altered through collective action when circumstances require fundamental change, rather than merely cosmetic adjustment. Yet these revolutionary changes remain incomplete and potentially reversible as long as the central questions that triggered the original conflict await resolution. The sovereign's personal fate, the nature of future governmental arrangements, the character of religious settlement, and the distribution of political authority among different social classes all require decisions that military victory has made possible but not inevitable. The First Civil War has ended, but the revolution that produced it continues to unfold through processes that none of the original participants fully anticipated or completely understand. The swords drawn in 1642 have accomplished more than their wielders intended, creating possibilities for human freedom that extend far beyond the limited constitutional questions that originally justified resistance. Yet they have also demonstrated the terrible costs that revolutionary change exacts from societies that choose transformation over accommodation, innovation over tradition, and uncertain liberty over familiar subjugation. The English people have paid a fearful price for their political education, but they have purchased knowledge that will serve future generations long after the immediate conflicts of the 1640s fade into historical memory. The First Civil War ends, but the Revolution continues, gathering momentum that will carry English society toward destinations that no one in 1642 could have foreseen or perhaps even desired. Victory brings its own perils, as the triumphant Westminster coalition discovers when military success dissolves the shared dangers that had temporarily united incompatible factions. The sovereign's surrender to Scottish forces in May 1646 eliminates the immediate external threat, while exposing the fundamental disagreements that tactical necessity had masked for 4 years. Without enemy armies to fight, former allies find themselves confronting each other across ideological chasms that prove as unbridgeable as any geographical barrier. The revolution that began with constitutional reform now faces its most dangerous moment: the fragmentation of revolutionary unity when victory seems within reach. The army of the Eastern Association encamps around London like a watchful guardian whose loyalties have become questionable to those it ostensibly protects. These men, transformed from amateur volunteers into professional soldiers, through years of shared hardship and religious enthusiasm, discover that their political education has proceeded far beyond their original mandate. Where once they fought simply to defend traditional liberties against arbitrary innovation, they now envision fundamental changes in social organization that terrify the moderate gentry who had assumed military victory would restore familiar arrangements under new management. Westminster itself divides between Presbyterian and independent factions, whose theological differences mask deeper disagreements about the revolution's proper limits. The Presbyterians, led by Denzil Holles and aligned with Scottish interests, desire settlement that would establish uniform religious organization throughout both kingdoms while restraining popular participation in governance. They view the army's political consciousness with alarm, recognizing that soldiers who question traditional authority in military matters will inevitably challenge social hierarchy in civilian life. The independents, including Oliver Cromwell and Henry Ireton, embrace religious toleration and expanded political participation that reflect their military experience of successful cooperation between different social classes and denominational groups. Their vision of godly rule through saints rather than birth creates possibilities for political transformation that extend far beyond the limited constitutional changes originally contemplated. Yet even they hesitate before the logical implications of principles they have championed when those principles threaten their own social position. The king, confined at Holmby House under nominal Scottish protection but actual English control, proves far from defeated despite his military situation. His personal charm, political sophistication, and genuine conviction that divine providence supports his cause create opportunities for manipulation that purely military considerations cannot address. Each faction competing for control of the revolutionary settlement requires his cooperation to legitimize their authority, giving him bargaining power that battlefield defeat should have eliminated entirely. His correspondence, maintained through networks that parliamentary oversight cannot entirely suppress, reveals the extent to which he views current circumstances as temporary setback rather than permanent defeat. Letters to his wife in France speak confidently of restoration through foreign intervention or domestic reconciliation, while communications with potential allies throughout the three kingdoms demonstrate his continued capacity to influence events despite physical captivity. The Scots, having delivered him to English custody in exchange for payment of their military expenses, discover that their religious objectives conflict with their political interests in ways that careful calculation had not anticipated. Presbyterian uniformity throughout both kingdoms serves Scottish ecclesiastical ambitions, while potentially subordinating Scotland to English authority in ways that threaten national independence. The alliance that proved essential for military victory against episcopal and royal tyranny begins generating problems that victory cannot solve. Religious passion, which had provided such powerful motivation during active warfare, becomes a source of division when competing interpretations of divine will produce incompatible political programs. The Westminster Assembly convened to establish religious settlement for the post-war kingdom. Fragments along lines that reflect not merely theological disagreement, but fundamental differences about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Presbyterians seek systematic organization that would ensure doctrinal uniformity while maintaining clerical independence from lay interference. Independents advocate congregational autonomy that reflects local circumstances and individual conscience, while preventing any single religious authority from dominating political decisions. More radical religious groups, emboldened by revolutionary success and convinced that millennium approaches, advance proposals that terrify moderate opinion, while inspiring popular enthusiasm among social groups previously excluded from political participation. Baptists question infant baptism while advocating adult conversion that implies fundamental equality between all regenerate souls regardless of social origin. Levelers combine religious enthusiasm with political theory that extends democratic participation to previously unenfranchised classes, while limiting governmental authority over individual conscience. The army's political consciousness develops through practical experience of collective decision-making that transcends traditional social boundaries, creating precedents that challenge fundamental assumptions about governmental authority and social organization. Regimental councils where common soldiers debate policy alongside officers demonstrate possibilities for popular participation that extend far beyond anything contemplated by moderate reformers. When these councils begin articulating comprehensive political programs, they transform military organization into a school for democratic theory that threatens existing arrangements throughout English society. The Leveller movement emerges from this military democracy, though its intellectual foundations extend beyond purely army concerns to encompass broader questions about the proper relationship between governors and governed. John Lilburne, William Walwyn, and Richard Overton developed systematic critiques of traditional authority that ground political legitimacy in popular consent rather than historical precedent or divine appointment. Their pamphlets circulate throughout London's apprentice communities and provincial market towns, spreading ideas that transform localized grievances into comprehensive alternatives to existing governmental structures. The Agreement of the People, presented to the army leadership in October 1647, represents the most radical democratic program yet advanced in English history. Its proposals for manhood suffrage, religious toleration, and governmental accountability to popular will extend revolutionary logic to conclusions that moderate leaders find both intellectually compelling and practically terrifying. The document demonstrates how military experience of successful cooperation between social classes has generated political theory that transcends the limited constitutional changes originally contemplated. The Putney debates, conducted throughout October and November 1647 in the parish church of that Thameside village, provide unprecedented public discussion of fundamental questions about political authority and social organization. Army officers, regimental representatives, and civilian theorists engage in philosophical arguments that would normally be confined to university disputations or private scholarly correspondence. The verbatim records of these discussions reveal the intellectual sophistication that revolutionary experience has produced among participants previously excluded from such elevated discourse. Colonel Thomas Rainsborough's declaration that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he articulates democratic principles that challenge every assumption about natural hierarchy and inherited authority. His exchanges with Henry Ireton about the relationship between property ownership and political participation exposed tensions within the revolutionary coalition that military success had temporarily concealed. When common soldiers argue constitutional theory with gentlemen officers as equals, traditional deference collapses in ways that extend far beyond immediate military concerns. The debates reveal how completely revolutionary experience has transformed participants' understanding of possible relationships between authority and liberty, individual conscience and collective obligation. Arguments that would have seemed fantastical in 1640 now appear as logical extensions of principles that parliamentary resistance to royal authority had necessarily invoked. The revolution has educated its participants in political possibilities that none of them originally intended to explore, but that the logic of events has made unavoidable. Yet intellectual coherence cannot resolve practical problems created by the monarch's continued existence as a focal point for alternative arrangements that might restore traditional authority under new management. His escape from custody in November 1647 transforms theoretical debates about political legitimacy into immediate questions about physical security and military control. Though quickly recaptured and removed to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, the incident demonstrates his continued capacity to influence events while highlighting the army's political isolation from moderate opinion that views military interference in civilian governance as itself a form of tyranny. The engagement with Scotland, secretly negotiated during his confinement, reveals the extent to which defeat has educated him in the revolutionary arts of conspiracy and manipulation. By promising to establish Presbyterian church government throughout England in exchange for military support, he attempts to exploit religious divisions within the parliamentary coalition while securing foreign assistance for restoration. The agreement demonstrates his continued refusal to accept the constitutional limitations that defeat should have imposed, while providing his enemies with evidence of duplicity that eliminates remaining hopes for negotiated settlement. The Second Civil War erupts throughout 1648 as royalist risings in Wales, Kent, and Essex coincide with the promised Scottish invasion, creating military challenges that test the army's political resolve as well as its tactical competence. These rebellions differ fundamentally from the earlier conflict because they represent not constitutional resistance to innovation, but counter-revolutionary attempts to restore traditional arrangements that military defeat had apparently eliminated. The stakes have escalated beyond questions of governmental procedure to encompass fundamental choices about the nature of English society itself. The Welsh Rising, led by Colonel John Poyer and centred on Pembroke Castle, demonstrates how quickly military allegiances can shift when political circumstances change. Poyer, who had served Westminster faithfully during the first conflict, now rebels against the very authority he had previously defended, illustrating the fragility of revolutionary loyalty when victory brings unexpected political consequences. His rebellion receives support from local communities that had grown weary of military rule and taxation, while yearning for the familiar certainties that royal restoration might provide. The Kentish Rising reveals similar tensions, as county communities that had supported parliamentary resistance to royal innovation now resist parliamentary authority that threatens local autonomy and traditional social relationships. The rebels' march on London attracts surprising popular support in areas that had previously embraced revolutionary change, suggesting that popular enthusiasm for political transformation has limits that prolonged conflict and military government have reached or exceeded. Oliver Cromwell's campaigns to suppress these rebellions demonstrate his evolution from military innovator to political architect of revolutionary consolidation. His siege of Pembroke Castle requires engineering skills that transcend purely tactical considerations, while his negotiations with Welsh communities reveal diplomatic abilities that complement his battlefield competence. Most significantly, his systematic destruction of royalist resistance eliminates the possibility of compromise settlement that might have preserved monarchical authority within constitutional limits. The Scottish invasion under the Duke of Hamilton represents the most serious external threat to revolutionary government since the war's beginning. Yet it also provides Cromwell with the opportunity to demonstrate the new model army's tactical superiority over traditional military organization. The Battle of Preston, fought on August 17th to 19th, 1648, destroys Scottish hopes while establishing Cromwell as the revolution's indispensable military leader, whose political influence now rivals his battlefield authority. The engagement reveals how completely English military organization has evolved beyond the amateur enthusiasm that characterized earlier campaigns. Cromwell's tactical coordination achieves decisive victory against numerically superior forces through systematic planning and disciplined execution that would have been impossible without years of professional development. His pursuit of defeated enemies extends far beyond immediate tactical considerations to eliminate Scottish capacity for renewed intervention, while demonstrating to potential foreign supporters the futility of military assistance to royalist restoration. More importantly, Preston provides Cromwell with the political capital necessary to resolve the constitutional crisis that threatens to paralyze revolutionary government indefinitely. His military success against foreign invasion legitimizes army interference in civilian politics, while his religious interpretation of victory as divine judgment provides theological justification for radical measures that secular considerations alone could not support. Pride's Purge, executed on December 6, 1648, represents the logical culmination of military frustration with parliamentary indecision about the monarch's fate. Colonel Thomas Pride, acting on orders from the army leadership, physically prevents moderate members from entering the House of Commons while arresting those who attempt to resist exclusion. The remaining rump, dominated by independents willing to pursue revolutionary logic to its ultimate conclusions, finally possesses the political will necessary to address questions that military victory had made unavoidable. The purge eliminates the last pretense that parliamentary authority derives from popular election rather than military force, yet it also resolves the constitutional deadlock that had prevented decisive action since 1646. The excluded members had represented constituencies that desired settlement, preserving monarchical authority within constitutional limits. But their continued presence made such settlement impossible while preventing alternative arrangements from emerging. Military intervention, however constitutionally questionable, at least allows governmental decisions to be made rather than endlessly debated. The trial of the king, conducted throughout January 1649 in Westminster Hall, where Strafford had faced similar proceedings 8 years earlier, represents unprecedented extension of legal accountability to royal authority that had traditionally claimed immunity from earthly judgment. The High Court of Justice, created specifically for this purpose, lacks precedent in English law, while drawing on theoretical arguments about popular sovereignty that parliamentary resistance had necessarily invoked without fully developing their implications. John Bradshaw, serving as president of the court, despite his relatively modest social origins, demonstrates how revolutionary circumstances create opportunities for advancement that traditional arrangements would never have provided. His confrontations with the defendant reveal the intellectual transformation that 8 years of constitutional crisis have produced. As a provincial lawyer argues questions of political theory with a monarch whose education and social position had supposedly prepared him for such discussions far better than mere legal training could provide. The king's refusal to recognize the court's authority reflects not merely personal obstinacy, but genuine conviction that divine appointment places him beyond human judgment, regardless of political circumstances. His dignity throughout the proceedings commands respect even from enemies, while his legal arguments possess sophistication that challenges the court's theoretical foundations. His insistence that he cannot be tried by any earthly authority, because he holds his commission from God himself, articulates the fundamental disagreement between traditional and revolutionary concepts of governmental legitimacy. His execution on January 30th, 1649, eliminates the possibility of restoration through negotiated settlement, while demonstrating the revolution's willingness to pursue its logic beyond any conceivable limits. The scaffold erected outside Whitehall Palace, where royal authority had so recently seemed unquestionable, provides the stage for drama that transforms English political consciousness permanently. When the axe falls, it severs not merely one man's life, but the psychological bonds that had connected English society to monarchical authority for over 1,000 years. The crowd's reaction, a great groan that rises from thousands of throats as the executioner displays the severed head, captures the mixture of horror and fascination that regicide produces among people who had never imagined such possibilities despite years of constitutional conflict. Foreign observers, accustomed to political violence that respects traditional forms while changing personnel, struggle to comprehend revolution that attacks the very foundations of governmental authority, rather than merely replacing incompetent rulers with more capable alternatives. The immediate abolition of monarchy and the House of Lords completes the constitutional revolution that began with resistance to ship money and Laudian religious innovations. The Commonwealth, proclaimed on February 7th, 1649, represents unprecedented experiment in republican government that lacks historical precedent in English experience, while drawing on classical and contemporary examples that provide limited guidance for practical governance. The revolution has achieved negative goals of eliminating royal and aristocratic authority, while facing the positive challenge of creating alternative institutions that can command popular allegiance and administrative competence. The Rump Parliament, reduced to fewer than 80 active members through purge and voluntary withdrawal, confronts enormous challenges with limited resources and questionable legitimacy. Its authority derives from military force rather than popular election, yet it must govern a society whose traditional loyalties have been severed without replacement by genuinely popular alternatives. The Commonwealth exists more in theoretical proclamation than practical reality, requiring administrative and ideological construction that revolutionary enthusiasm alone cannot provide. Ireland erupts in renewed rebellion as Catholic confederates, shocked by the king's execution, rally around his son's claims, while Protestant settlers, horrified by regicide, question their allegiance to a government that has murdered their lawful sovereign. The island becomes a refuge for royalist resistance, while threatening to serve as a base for foreign intervention that could restore traditional authority through external force. Cromwell's Irish expedition, launched in August 1649, aims to eliminate this threat while demonstrating the Commonwealth's capacity for decisive military action. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, where Cromwell's forces show no quarter to garrisons that refuse immediate surrender, reveal the extent to which revolutionary warfare has transcended the limited violence of the earlier civil conflicts. These actions, justified by the laws of war against rebellious subjects and defended as divine judgment against Catholic idolatry, demonstrate how religious conviction can sanction brutality that purely political considerations might have restrained. They establish Cromwell's reputation for ruthless efficiency while generating hatred that will poison Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. Scotland's continued adherence to the young Charles Stuart provides another external challenge to Commonwealth authority, while testing the revolution's commitment to its own principles. The Scots' proclamation of Charles II as king throughout his dominions directly challenges republican authority while claiming to defend legitimate monarchy against usurped power. David Leslie's preparations for renewed military intervention forced the Commonwealth to choose between toleration of neighbouring monarchy and expansion of revolutionary authority beyond England's traditional boundaries. The European response to regicide ranges from horror to calculation as continental powers assess the implications of successful revolution for their own domestic arrangements. France, recently emerged from its own civil conflicts, condemns the king's execution while secretly welcoming the elimination of a potential source of instability. Spain offers refuge to royalist exiles while avoiding commitments that might provoke Commonwealth retaliation against Spanish commerce. The Dutch Republic, despite its own republican traditions, maintains careful neutrality while expanding trade relationships that revolutionary disruption has made profitable. The Commonwealth's isolation in a world of hostile monarchies forces reliance on domestic resources while limiting options for foreign assistance that other revolutionary governments have employed to consolidate their authority. This isolation, however, also prevents external interference that might have complicated the revolution's internal development, while encouraging administrative innovations that purely domestic circumstances require. The new government must succeed through its own efforts or fail through its own limitations. Religious settlement remains incomplete as competing Protestant denominations struggle to define the Commonwealth's spiritual character without the unifying opposition to episcopal authority that had temporarily reconciled their differences. Independent congregations flourish under governmental toleration, while Presbyterian aspirations for systematic organization remain unfulfilled. More radical religious groups advance millenarian expectations that terrify moderate opinion, while inspiring popular enthusiasm among social classes that view political revolution as prelude to spiritual transformation. The army's continued political role creates tensions between civilian and military authority that threaten to transform the Commonwealth into a military dictatorship despite its republican proclamations. Soldiers who view themselves as instruments of divine will resist subordination to civilian authority that lacks comparable claims to religious legitimacy. Their corporate consciousness, developed through years of shared hardship and theological discussion, creates an alternative source of governmental authority that competes with parliamentary institutions while making genuine civilian control impossible to achieve. Economic challenges multiply as military expenses consume resources that peacetime taxation might have provided for constructive purposes, while trade disruption limits governmental revenues that normal commerce would have generated. The Commonwealth inherits enormous debts from the civil wars, while facing continuing military expenses that foreign threats and domestic instability require. Innovation in taxation and administration becomes essential for survival, while potentially alienating social groups whose support revolutionary government desperately needs. As 1649 concludes, the Commonwealth faces an uncertain future that its founders never clearly envisioned when they began resistance to royal innovation nearly a decade earlier. The revolution has achieved decisive military victory while creating political problems that military force cannot solve. Traditional authority has been destroyed, while alternative arrangements remain experimental and contested. The execution of the king has eliminated one source of governmental legitimacy, while failing to establish convincing replacement that commands comparable allegiance among the governed. Yet the Commonwealth also represents unprecedented achievement in human political development, proof that established authority can be successfully challenged, that governmental arrangements can be fundamentally altered through popular action, and that new institutions can emerge from revolutionary destruction of traditional forms. Whatever its ultimate fate, the English Republic has demonstrated possibilities for human freedom that will inspire future generations long after immediate circumstances have changed beyond recognition. The broken peace has led to regicide, regicide to republic, and republic to uncertainty that makes prediction impossible while making hope essential. The revolution continues, gathering momentum toward destinations that none of its original architects imagined, but that the logic of events has made unavoidable. England enters the 1650s as a commonwealth without precedent, sustained by conviction that human beings can create better arrangements than history has provided, while haunted by doubts about whether revolutionary enthusiasm can substitute for traditional loyalties that gave stability to less perfect but more familiar governmental forms. The English Republic enters its first spring like a newborn thrust into a hostile world, gasping for breath while enemies circle with predatory patience. February's proclamation that the people are, under God, the original of all just power, sounds magnificent in Westminster Hall, yet beyond London's boundaries, the Commonwealth confronts realities that constitutional theory cannot address. Three kingdoms lie fractured by a decade of warfare, their traditional loyalties severed, but their alternative allegiances uncertain. The task before the Rump Parliament exceeds anything attempted in European history, creating legitimate government from revolutionary destruction, while maintaining power against foreign enemies and domestic opponents who view regicide as an unforgivable crime against divine order. Ireland bleeds like an open wound that threatens to poison the entire Republican experiment. The Confederate Catholics, horrified by their anointed sovereign's execution, rally around his son's claims, while English Protestant settlers question their allegiance to a government that has murdered their lawful king. From Ulster to Munster, castle garrisons declare for the young exile, while royalist agents promise foreign intervention that might restore traditional authority throughout the three kingdoms. The island becomes both refuge for counter-revolutionary forces and potential launching point for invasions that could strangle the infant republic in its cradle. Oliver Cromwell accepts command of the Irish expedition with characteristic blend of practical calculation and religious conviction, understanding that military necessity serves divine purposes while advancing his own political fortunes. His preparations reveal the systematic approach that has made him indispensable to revolutionary survival. Careful recruitment, adequate supply, and theological motivation that transforms brutal warfare into cosmic struggle between godly reformation and satanic reaction. The Lord General who sails from Milford Haven in August 1649 carries more than military commission. He bears the Commonwealth's hopes for demonstrating that Republican government possesses the strength to defend itself against all enemies. The siege of Drogheda unfolds with mathematical precision that conceals its psychological impact on participants and observers throughout Europe. Cromwell's demand for immediate surrender receives contemptuous refusal from Sir Arthur Aston, the royalist governor who believes stone walls and foreign reinforcements will preserve his position until circumstances change. The subsequent assault demonstrates how completely English military organisation has evolved beyond the amateur enthusiasm of 1642. A systematic artillery bombardment creates breaches that disciplined infantry exploits with coordination that professional armies might envy. Yet when the walls fall and Puritan soldiers pour through the gaps, military professionalism yields to religious fury that transforms tactical success into theological statement. The massacre that follows, garrison and civilians alike put to the sword without regard for surrender or sanctuary, represents Cromwell's deliberate decision to terrorize Irish resistance into submission while demonstrating divine judgment against Catholic idolatry. His own account, dispatched to Westminster with clinical detachment, describes the slaughter as righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who had participated in the 1641 rebellion against Protestant settlers. Wexford suffers similar fate when its garrison refuses terms, though here accident rather than policy triggers the bloodbath that claims thousands of lives within hours. The psychological impact extends far beyond immediate casualties. As news spreads throughout Ireland that quarter cannot be expected from soldiers who view their campaign as divine mission rather than conventional warfare, castle after castle surrenders without resistance, as commanders calculate that discretion serves survival better than heroic gestures that promise only death without glory. The systematic nature of Cromwell's Irish conquest reveals how completely republican government has embraced methods that monarchy might have hesitated to employ for fear of diplomatic consequences. Where Charles I had sought accommodation with Irish Catholics to secure military support against parliamentary opposition, the Commonwealth pursues extermination of Catholic political power, while confiscating lands that will reward English investors and military veterans. The rebellion that began with constitutional resistance to royal innovation now implements policies of ethnic cleansing that exceed anything contemplated by Stuart absolutism. The transplantation westward of Catholic landowners creates human misery on unprecedented scale while serving the Commonwealth's financial and security needs. Connaught becomes a vast reservation where dispossessed Irish subsist on marginal lands, while their former estates enrich English creditors who had financed the Republic's military operations. The phrase, "to hell or to Connaught," captures the stark choice facing Irish Catholics: exile to barren western counties, or transportation to Caribbean plantations, where tropical diseases promise quick death for European constitutions. These policies generate wealth that stabilizes the Commonwealth's precarious finances, while creating stakeholders whose prosperity depends on Republican survival. English merchants who purchase confiscated estates at bargain prices become enemies of any restoration that might restore Catholic proprietors, while discharged soldiers who receive land grants in lieu of back pay develop material interests in maintaining the settlement that war has achieved. Economic transformation serves political consolidation, as the revolution creates beneficiaries whose future security requires its permanent success. Scotland presents different challenges that military force alone cannot resolve, as the Northern Kingdom maintains legitimate government that recognises Charles II while claiming independence from English authority. David Leslie's preparations for renewed military intervention forced the Commonwealth to choose between tolerating neighbouring monarchy and extending republican rule beyond England's traditional boundaries. The decision to invade Scotland represents unprecedented expansion of revolutionary authority, while demonstrating that ideological principles can justify territorial aggression as readily as defensive warfare. The Battle of Dunbar, fought on September 3, 1650, provides Cromwell with his most complete military triumph, while revealing the extent to which religious conviction can overcome numerical disadvantage. Leslie's Scottish army, superior in numbers and occupying strong defensive positions, should have destroyed the English invaders who find themselves trapped between hostile forces and the North Sea. Yet Cromwell's tactical genius, combined with his soldiers' faith that divine providence supports their cause, transforms apparent disaster into decisive victory that eliminates Scottish military resistance while opening the path to Edinburgh. The engagement demonstrates how completely religious motivation has fused with professional competence to create military effectiveness that transcends conventional calculations of relative strength. English soldiers advance against superior numbers while singing psalms, their confidence rooted in conviction that God fights alongside his chosen people against Presbyterian error and Stuart tyranny. When Scottish lines break under coordinated assault, fleeing soldiers carry news of defeat throughout the kingdom, while Cromwell's pursuit eliminates organized resistance that might have prolonged the campaign. Charles II's Scottish adventure, culminating in his coronation at Scone on January 1st, 1651, represents desperate attempt to restore monarchical authority through alliance with former enemies who had opposed his father's religious policies. The young exile's acceptance of Presbyterian conditions that contradict his personal convictions demonstrates how completely circumstances have reduced royal authority to dependence on supporters whose own interests conflict with traditional monarchical prerogatives. His promised establishment of Presbyterian church government throughout his dominions serves Scottish ecclesiastical ambitions while abandoning English Episcopalians who had suffered persecution for their loyalty to Stuart religious policies. The invasion of England that follows proves anticlimactic as English populations, exhausted by a decade of warfare and suspicious of Scottish intentions, fail to rally to royalist banners that promise restoration through foreign conquest. The Commonwealth's propaganda effectively portrays the invasion as alien aggression rather than legitimate government reclaiming its authority, while military preparations demonstrate Republican capacity for organizing national defense without traditional monarchical leadership. Local militias that had resisted parliamentary taxation during the civil wars now support the established government against external threats that endanger their community's security. Worcester, fought exactly 1 year after Dunbar, eliminates the last serious military challenge to Commonwealth authority while completing Cromwell's transformation from provincial gentleman to national saviour. His tactical coordination achieves overwhelming victory against an army that includes not merely Scottish invaders, but English royalists who had hoped foreign intervention might restore traditional arrangements. The systematic destruction of enemy forces, followed by ruthless pursuit that prevents reorganization, demonstrates that Republican military organization has achieved capabilities that monarchical government never possessed. Charles Stuart's escape to France, aided by loyal supporters who risk their lives to preserve his person, provides romantic conclusion to military campaigns that establish Cromwell's political supremacy within the Commonwealth, while eliminating external threats to Republican survival. The royal miracle of the young king's flight through hostile countryside captures popular imagination while changing nothing fundamental about the strategic situation that has left the Republic master of the three kingdoms. Cromwell returns to London as the indispensable man whose military genius has secured revolutionary achievements against all enemies. Yet military success creates political problems that victory cannot solve. As the Rump Parliament discovers, when electoral mandates expired years earlier leave governmental authority dependent on armed force rather than popular consent, the original members who had survived Pride's purge now claim legitimacy through revolutionary precedent rather than constitutional election, while their number dwindles through death and withdrawal until fewer than 60 active participants attempt to govern three kingdoms whose populations exceed 5 million souls. Democratic theory that grounds authority in popular will becomes mockery when representatives rule without mandate while preventing new elections that might repudiate their policies. Cromwell's relationship with the surviving legislators deteriorates as his military success enhances his political influence, while parliamentary authority contracts through its own inherent weaknesses. The officers who had followed him through Irish bogs and Scottish highlands develop corporate consciousness that transcends civilian control, viewing themselves as instruments of divine will, whose religious insights exceed those of mere politicians. Their prayer meetings and theological discussions create alternative source of governmental authority that competes with parliamentary institutions while claiming superior legitimacy through military service and spiritual revelation. The dissolution of the Rump Parliament on April 20th, 1653, represents Cromwell's recognition that revolutionary government requires institutional changes that existing arrangements cannot provide. His dramatic entrance into the Commons chamber, accompanied by armed soldiers who remove the parliamentary mace while legislators flee in confusion, eliminates the pretense that civilian authority controls military power. The scene recalls Charles I's attempted arrest of the 5 members 11 years earlier, yet the circumstances have reversed completely. Now military force serves revolutionary principles against parliamentary obstruction, rather than royal tyranny against representative government. You have sat too long for any good you have been doing, Cromwell thunders at the departing members, his words capturing frustration that military victories have failed to produce governmental effectiveness or popular support. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go. The dissolution eliminates the last institutional link to the Parliament that had initiated resistance to royal authority in 1640, completing the transformation of constitutional opposition into military dictatorship that depends entirely on one man's authority and charisma. The bare-bones Parliament, summoned through religious rather than electoral processes, represents Cromwell's attempt to create godly government through saints rather than professional politicians whose secular concerns conflict with spiritual reformation. The 140 members, nominated by independent congregations throughout the three kingdoms, include Leatherseller Praise God Barebone, whose name provides popular designation for an assembly that contemporary critics mockingly call the Parliament of Saints. Their deliberations reveal both the sincerity of Puritan Reformation and its practical limitations when religious enthusiasm confronts administrative necessity. The nominated assembly's radical proposals, abolition of tithes, reform of legal procedures, simplification of governmental machinery, demonstrate how completely military victory has educated ordinary citizens in political possibilities that traditional arrangements had discouraged. Merchants and farmers, who had never aspired to national influence, now debate constitutional questions with sophistication that university education might not have provided, their insights sharpened by practical experience of successful resistance to established authority. Yet their religious convictions, however admirable in personal conduct, prove inadequate guides for governmental policy that requires compromise between competing interests and accommodation with social realities that spiritual reformation cannot immediately transform. The Assembly's dissolution in December 1653 achieved through conservative members' voluntary surrender of their authority back to the Lord General, demonstrates the practical impossibility of governing through religious enthusiasm alone. Cromwell accepts their resignation with apparent reluctance that masks his recognition that effective government requires institutional arrangements that transcend individual virtue or collective piety. The experiment in godly rule through saints has failed, not because its participants lack dedication, but because complex societies require administrative competence that religious conviction alone cannot provide. The instrument of government, drafted by military officers and civilian administrators who understand the practical requirements of effective governance, creates the Protectorate that will define English government for the remainder of the Republican period. Oliver Cromwell becomes Lord Protector with executive authority that resembles monarchical power, while lacking traditional legitimacy that hereditary succession provides. The Constitution attempts to balance military necessity with civilian participation, religious reformation with practical administration, revolutionary principles with governmental effectiveness. The new arrangements satisfy no faction completely, while providing framework for governance that transcends the personal authority of individual leaders. Triennial parliaments will limit protectoral power, while ensuring popular participation in governmental decisions. Yet electoral qualifications that exclude the poorest citizens demonstrate the revolution's retreat from democratic experiments that had proven socially dangerous. Religious toleration protects Protestant diversity while maintaining restrictions on Catholic worship that reflect both theological conviction and political calculation about potential threats to Republican security. Cromwell's personal rule as Lord Protector reveals the tensions between revolutionary principles and practical governance that no constitutional arrangement can entirely resolve. His sincere commitment to religious liberty conflicts with political necessity that requires controlling potential sources of opposition, while his belief in popular participation contradicts military circumstances that make civilian authority dependent on armed force. The Protector, who had championed parliamentary rights against royal authority, now exercises powers that exceed anything Charles I had claimed, justified by emergency circumstances that seem to require permanent exception from normal constitutional limitations. The Major Generals, appointed in 1655 to govern England through military districts that transcend traditional county boundaries, represent the logical conclusion of Republican dependence on armed force for political authority. These regional commanders, each responsible for several counties and answerable directly to the Protector, implement policies of moral reformation and political surveillance that extend governmental control into areas of private life that previous English governments had rarely attempted to regulate. Their authority supersedes local magistrates and county officials, whose traditional independence had formed the foundation of English local government for centuries. The moral reformation campaign that the Major Generals implement with systematic thoroughness reveals the extent to which Puritan principles can justify governmental interference in personal conduct when backed by military authority. Alehouses close throughout the country, while theatrical performances face prohibition that reflects both religious conviction about moral corruption and political calculation about potential centers of seditious assembly. Horse racing, cockfighting, and other traditional entertainments disappear under official disapproval that extends Puritan discipline far beyond voluntary religious communities into general social regulation. Yet these policies generate popular resentment that demonstrates the limits of revolutionary enthusiasm when extended to comprehensive social control. Communities that had supported parliamentary resistance to royal authority now chafe under military supervision that intrudes into local customs and personal choices that had previously enjoyed autonomy from governmental interference. The major generals discover that efficient administration and popular support require different approaches, while their reports to Westminster reveal growing opposition to policies that seem to threaten traditional English liberties as seriously as Stuart innovations had done. The Spanish War, launched in 1655 against Europe's premier Catholic power, demonstrates the Protectorate's capacity for aggressive foreign policy, while revealing how completely religious conviction can justify territorial expansion and commercial competition. Cromwell's Western design aims to break Spanish monopoly in the Caribbean, while serving Protestant interests against Catholic tyranny. Yet its practical implementation focuses on commercial advantages that English merchants hope to gain through military conquest. The expedition that captures Jamaica, while failing to take Hispaniola, achieves mixed results that enhance English naval prestige without providing the decisive blow against Spanish power that its planners had anticipated. The alliance with France against Spain represents pragmatic calculation that transcends religious considerations, as Protestant England cooperates with Catholic France to achieve strategic objectives that serve both nations' interests. The Battle of the Dunes in 1658, where English troops fighting alongside French forces defeat Spanish armies, demonstrates the Protectorate's military effectiveness while completing England's emergence as a major European power. Dunkirk's capture provides England with continental foothold, while the campaign's success enhances Cromwell's international reputation as Europe's most formidable military leader. Yet foreign success cannot resolve domestic problems that military government has created, while failing to establish legitimate constitutional arrangements that command popular allegiance. The Protectorate depends entirely on Cromwell's personal authority and military support, yet both resources prove inadequate for creating institutional stability that might survive their removal. Opposition grows among social groups that had initially supported parliamentary resistance, but now find Republican government more oppressive than royal authority had been, while religious radicals who had expected millennial transformation expressed disappointment with moderate policies that preserve existing social arrangements. The humble petition and advice presented by the Parliament of 1657 reveals the extent to which even Republican legislators desire return to traditional constitutional forms that might provide legitimacy through historical precedent rather than revolutionary innovation. The offer of kingship to Cromwell demonstrates that monarchical government retains psychological appeal even among those who had participated in regicide, while the proposed restoration of a second chamber indicates recognition that bicameral arrangements might provide institutional stability that unicameral experiments have failed to achieve. Cromwell's rejection of the crown after months of deliberation reflects his understanding that accepting royal title would alienate military supporters, whose republicanism forms the foundation of his authority, while failing to satisfy traditional loyalists whose allegiance remains committed to Stuart restoration. His decision to remain Lord Protector preserves military unity while limiting options for constitutional development that might have provided alternative legitimacy for his government. The revolution that had begun with resistance to royal innovation now faces the paradox that its survival requires institutional arrangements that resemble the monarchy it had destroyed. The Protector's declining health through 1657 and 1658 creates succession crisis that the instrument of government's provisions cannot resolve satisfactorily. Richard Cromwell's designation as heir apparent reflects his father's hope that personal qualities might substitute for political experience and military reputation. Yet the younger man lacks both the religious authority and the martial prestige that had made his father indispensable to Republican survival. The revolution that had depended on one man's genius now faces the test of whether institutional arrangements can transcend individual leadership. Oliver Cromwell's death on September 3rd, 1658, the anniversary of his victories at Dunbar and Worcester, eliminates the single figure whose authority had held together incompatible forces and conflicting interests that revolutionary circumstances had temporarily united. His final illness, endured with characteristic stoicism and religious faith, provides opportunity for reflection on achievements that had exceeded any reasonable expectations while falling short of the complete reformation that Puritan hopes had anticipated. The Lord Protector, who had risen from provincial obscurity to reshape three kingdoms, dies uncertain whether his work will survive the removal of its architect. The funeral arrangements that follow reveal both the grandeur and the uncertainty that characterize the Protectorate's final moments. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey, conducted with regal magnificence that rivals any royal obsequies, demonstrates the honours that Republican achievement can command, while highlighting the absence of traditional legitimacy that might ensure institutional continuity. Foreign dignitaries attend the lying in state, while domestic opponents calculate whether Cromwell's death creates opportunities for restoring arrangements that military force had seemed to eliminate permanently. Richard Cromwell's peaceful succession suggests that institutional transfer of authority might be possible within Republican arrangements, yet the new protector inherits problems that his father's charisma had contained rather than solved. The army's corporate consciousness, developed through years of shared religious and political experience, creates alternative source of authority that competes with civilian government while claiming superior legitimacy through military service and spiritual insight. The financial crisis that military expenses have created requires parliamentary cooperation that the Protectorate's constitutional arrangements make difficult to achieve. As 1658 concludes with England under new protectoral authority, the Commonwealth faces uncertain future that its founders could never have anticipated when they began resistance to royal ship money and religious innovation nearly 2 decades earlier. The revolution has achieved military dominance over all enemies, while creating governmental arrangements that depend on force rather than consent, religious enthusiasm rather than constitutional tradition, personal authority rather than institutional legitimacy. Whether these revolutionary expedients can evolve into stable arrangements that command popular allegiance remains to be determined. The Protectorate that Oliver Cromwell bequeaths to his son represents unprecedented achievement in human political development, proof that determined minorities can reshape governmental arrangements when circumstances favor revolutionary change, that military organization can serve political reformation when guided by principled leadership, and that constitutional innovation can create alternatives to traditional authority when supported by adequate force. Yet it also demonstrates the limitations of revolutionary government that lacks popular roots, the dangers of military rule that transcends civilian control, and the difficulties of creating legitimate institutions from revolutionary destruction of traditional forms. The great experiment in republican government enters its final phase, with achievements that inspire admiration and problems that threaten dissolution. England has become Europe's most formidable military power, while remaining internally unstable, has achieved religious toleration while imposing political restrictions, has demonstrated governmental efficiency while lacking constitutional legitimacy. The revolution continues, yet its direction becomes increasingly uncertain, as the authority that had sustained it through 2 decades of crisis passes to leaders whose qualifications remain untested by the challenges that await them. The bells that toll for Oliver Cromwell on September 3rd, 1658, mark more than one man's passing. They herald the beginning of the end for an experiment in republican government that had depended too heavily on individual genius to survive its creator's death. Richard Cromwell receives the protectoral authority with all the ceremonial dignity that his father's achievements have earned. Yet the quiet scholar who inherits power lacks both the military reputation and the religious charisma that had made the previous protector indispensable to revolutionary survival. The younger man possesses many admirable qualities: moderation, learning, personal integrity, but none of the extraordinary characteristics that desperate circumstances require. England watches with collective uncertainty as Tumbledown Dick, as his critics mockingly call him, attempts to govern three kingdoms whose stability had rested entirely on his father's formidable personality. The new protector brings no military experience to guide decisions about army organization, no theological authority to resolve religious disputes, and no political base beyond his inherited position. His appointment reflects hereditary succession rather than demonstrated competence, violating the meritocratic principles that had elevated his father from provincial obscurity to national leadership, while creating precedent that resembles the monarchical arrangements the Revolution had supposedly eliminated. The army that had followed Oliver through Irish bogs and Scottish highlands views Richard with barely concealed contempt, understanding that their corporate identity transcends any individual's authority, while their political consciousness has evolved far beyond simple obedience to inherited command. These veteran soldiers have participated in regicide, conquered kingdoms, and reshaped three nations according to their vision of godly reformation. They cannot easily accept subordination to a civilian whose only qualification derives from biological accident rather than proven service to the revolutionary cause. Major General John Lambert emerges as the most formidable challenger to protectoral authority. His military reputation earned through years of professional service, while his political ambitions encompass radical changes that Richard's moderate temperament cannot accommodate. Lambert's supporters, among the officer corps, argue that England requires strong leadership capable of defending Republican achievements against foreign enemies and domestic opponents who view Oliver's death as opportunity for counter-revolutionary action. Their petitions for governmental reform contain thinly veiled threats that civilian authority depends entirely on military consent. The financial crisis that Oliver had managed through personal prestige and foreign success overwhelms his successor's limited political resources. England's debt, accumulated through 2 decades of warfare and foreign intervention, exceeds anything previous English governments had faced, while the Commonwealth's revenue sources remain inadequate for both military expenses and civilian administration. The army's arrears alone approach £900,000, while additional obligations for Ireland, Scotland, and continental commitments strain governmental finances beyond any sustainable level. Richard's attempts to address these problems through parliamentary cooperation expose the fundamental weakness of his position. He possesses neither the authority to command nor the resources to bargain effectively with factions whose interests conflict with protectoral prerogatives. The officers who had accepted Oliver's autocratic tendencies because they respected his military genius resist similar limitations imposed by a leader whose battlefield experience consists entirely of reading classical histories. Their corporate meetings, conducted with increasing boldness throughout the autumn and winter of 1658, develop into alternative government that claims superior legitimacy through military service and religious dedication. The Parliament summoned in January 1659 represents Richard's last hope for establishing constitutional foundation that might transcend the personal authority he lacks. Yet the Assembly immediately fractures along lines that reflect the Revolution's unresolved tensions. Republicans who had supported the Commonwealth before Oliver's assumption of protectoral power view restoration of parliamentary supremacy as opportunity to reclaim authority that military dictatorship had usurped. Moderate members hope for settlement that might preserve republican institutions while eliminating the military interference that has made civilian government impossible. Yet the elections themselves demonstrate how completely the revolutionary coalition has disintegrated under the pressures of prolonged military rule and social experimentation. Presbyterian interests, suppressed during Oliver's ascendancy, reassert themselves with demands for religious uniformity that threaten the independent congregations whose support had sustained the Protectorate. Former royalists, emboldened by Oliver's death and encouraged by foreign agents, begin testing the boundaries of acceptable political discourse while calculating whether circumstances favor open resistance to republican authority. The debates that follow reveal intellectual exhaustion among revolutionary leaders who have spent 20 years defending principles whose practical implementation has created more problems than solutions. The same constitutional questions that had paralyzed the Rump Parliament resurface with added urgency. How can republican government achieve legitimacy without popular mandate? How can military necessity be reconciled with civilian control? How can religious reformation proceed without social revolution that threatens all existing arrangements? John Thurlow, Oliver's former Secretary of State and master of intelligence networks that span Europe, provides Richard with detailed reports about foreign conspiracies and domestic plots that threaten the Protectorate from multiple directions simultaneously. The Spanish court harbors English exiles, who coordinate with domestic agents, while French diplomats calculate whether supporting Charles Stuart serves their interests better than maintaining relations with an increasingly unstable English republic. Throughout the three kingdoms, former royalists emerge from concealment to test governmental responses while assessing opportunities for coordinated action. The young Charles, maturing in continental exile, while observing English developments with increasing hope, has learned political lessons that his father's rigid principles had prevented him from mastering. Where Charles I had insisted on unconditional restoration of royal prerogatives, his son demonstrates willingness to accept constitutional limitations that might facilitate his return, while preserving monarchical authority in modified form. His correspondence with potential supporters emphasizes moderation and reconciliation rather than revenge, appealing to war weariness that 20 years of conflict have produced throughout English society. The Sealed Knot, the primary royalist organization within England, maintains careful coordination with exiled leaders, while developing networks that could support restoration when circumstances become favorable. Their membership includes former army officers who had served Parliament faithfully until disillusionment with Republican government converted them to monarchical sympathy, country gentlemen whose estates have suffered under military rule and excessive taxation, and merchants whose commercial interests conflict with the Protectorate's foreign policies. Richard's relationship with the army leadership deteriorates throughout the spring of 1659, as his attempts to assert civilian authority encounter increasingly bold resistance from officers who view their military service as superior qualification for governmental authority. The petition presented by senior commanders in April demands virtual control over military appointments, financial administration, and religious policy, reducing the protector to ceremonial figurehead whose authority derives entirely from their consent. The document represents military coup disguised as constitutional reform. The crisis escalates when Richard attempts to dissolve Parliament in April 1659, hoping to eliminate the institutional opposition that has paralyzed his government while demonstrating protectoral authority that his critics question. Yet the dissolution requires military support that the army leadership refuses to provide, revealing the complete dependence of civilian authority on armed force that no longer accepts civilian direction. The protector, who cannot command obedience from either parliament or army, possesses no real power, despite his theoretical constitutional position. The Rump Parliament's restoration in May 1659, achieved through military intervention that sweeps aside protectoral authority as casually as it had previously eliminated royal government, represents the army's decision to govern directly rather than through civilian intermediaries, whose independence threatens military corporate interests. The surviving members, who had been purged 11 years earlier, returned to Westminster with renewed determination to establish republican government that subordinates military power to parliamentary authority. Yet they lack the practical means to enforce civilian control over forces whose political consciousness has evolved far beyond simple obedience. Richard Cromwell's resignation, announced with dignity that contrasts favourably with the undignified circumstances that have made his position untenable, eliminates the last constitutional barrier to military dictatorship while completing the revolution's transformation from parliamentary resistance to army rule. His retirement to private life, pursued with the scholarly interests that had always attracted him more than political power, provides symbolic conclusion to the hereditary succession experiment that had violated republican principles while failing to achieve monarchical stability. The army's direct assumption of governmental authority through the Committee of Safety represents the logical culmination of 2 decades of constitutional experimentation that has consistently demonstrated the impossibility of subordinating military power to civilian control when armed forces possess independent political consciousness. John Lambert's emergence as the regime's effective leader reflects his military competence and radical political vision, yet his authority depends entirely on military support that could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. George Monk's position in Scotland becomes crucial as the only major military commander whose loyalty to the existing government remains questionable. His Army of Scotland, disciplined through years of occupation duty and relatively isolated from the political ferment affecting English garrisons, possesses both the unity and the strength necessary to determine the outcome of any civil conflict. Monk himself, a professional soldier whose career had begun under royal authority before circumstances converted him to parliamentary service, maintains careful neutrality while assessing which course serves both his personal interests and his nation's welfare. The correspondence between London and Edinburgh reveals the extent to which governmental authority has fragmented among competing factions whose mutual suspicions prevent effective coordination against external threats or domestic opposition. Lambert's supporters in England demand Monk's submission to the Committee of Safety, while threatening military action if he refuses compliance. Monk's responses maintain formal correctness while avoiding commitments that might compromise his freedom of action when circumstances clarify. Economic collapse accelerates as political uncertainty undermines commercial confidence, while military expenses consume resources that productive activity might have generated. London merchants who had initially supported parliamentary resistance now question whether republican government can provide the stability that profitable trade requires. Tax collection becomes increasingly difficult as local authorities refuse cooperation with a government whose legitimacy derives entirely from military force, while foreign creditors demand payment of obligations that the Commonwealth lacks resources to honour. Religious radicalism flourishes in the absence of effective governmental control, as sectarian groups that had been restrained during Oliver's rule now advance millenarian expectations that terrify moderate opinion. Fifth monarchists proclaim the imminent establishment of Christ's kingdom on earth, while demanding immediate implementation of Mosaic law that would eliminate existing legal and social arrangements entirely. Quakers, Baptists, and other separatist congregations multiply throughout the country, their democratic practices in spiritual matters encouraging similar experiments in secular governance that challenge traditional authority at every level. The winter of 1659 to 1660 brings England to the edge of complete governmental collapse, as competing authorities claim legitimacy while lacking practical means to enforce their decisions beyond the immediate reach of their military supporters. Regional commanders pursue independent policies that serve local interests rather than national coordination, while foreign observers calculate whether English weakness creates opportunities for territorial expansion or commercial advantage that aggressive action might secure. Monk's decision to march south from Scotland in January 1660 represents the crucial moment when personal choice determines national destiny. His army of Scotland crosses the border with systematic discipline that demonstrates professional competence while maintaining political neutrality that prevents premature commitment to any particular constitutional settlement. The general's proclamations emphasize restoration of parliamentary authority and constitutional government without specifying whether these objectives require republican or monarchical arrangements. The march toward London becomes a triumph of military organization over political chaos as Monk's forces advance through countryside that welcomes any authority capable of imposing order on the anarchy that competitive governments have created. Local magistrates who had withdrawn from public service rather than serve illegitimate authority emerged to offer cooperation with commanders whose professional competence promises effective administration regardless of their ultimate political objectives. Lambert's attempt to oppose Monk's advance collapses when his own forces, unpaid and demoralized by years of political uncertainty, desert rather than fight fellow soldiers whose only apparent crime consists of demanding legitimate government. The confrontation that might have precipitated another civil war dissolves into negotiation as officers on both sides recognize their common interest in preventing further military conflict that would benefit only foreign enemies and domestic opponents of all governmental authority. Monk's entrance into London in February 1660 eliminates the last military obstacle to constitutional settlement, while demonstrating that professional soldiers can subordinate personal ambition to national necessity when circumstances require decisive action. His careful negotiations with surviving parliamentary leaders, army commanders, and civilian authorities reveal diplomatic skills that complement his military reputation, while suggesting that effective government requires leaders capable of transcending factional loyalties that had paralyzed previous administrations. The restoration of the Long Parliament, achieved through Monk's insistence that constitutional legitimacy requires readmission of members excluded by Pride's Purge 12 years earlier, creates the political framework necessary for legal resolution of the governmental crisis. The returning members bring with them not merely individual grievances, but collective memory of the constitutional principles that had justified resistance to royal authority before military necessity had transformed parliamentary opposition into republican revolution. Yet the constitutional questions that had triggered the original crisis remain fundamentally unresolved despite 2 decades of military and political experimentation. The relationship between executive and legislative authority, the proper limits of religious toleration, the balance between individual liberty and collective security, the distribution of political power among different social classes, all await decisions that restored parliamentary government must address, while accommodating interests that revolutionary experience has created or transformed. The negotiations with Charles Stuart, conducted through intermediaries who maintain plausible deniability while exploring terms that might facilitate restoration, reveal how completely circumstances have altered the balance of political power since his father's execution 11 years earlier. The young king's willingness to accept constitutional limitations that his predecessor had rejected reflects both personal pragmatism and political education that exile has provided, while revolutionary government has discredited itself through internal conflicts and administrative failures. The Declaration of Breda, issued in April 1660, represents Charles's understanding that successful restoration requires reconciliation rather than revenge, accommodation rather than absolute authority. His promises of religious toleration, parliamentary consultation, and legal amnesty for most revolutionary participants address the concerns of groups whose support or neutrality will be essential for peaceful transition to restored monarchical government. The document demonstrates how completely the revolution has educated even its opponents in the political realities that effective governance requires. The Convention Parliament's invitation to Charles II, extended in May 1660, completes the constitutional process that transforms restoration from military conquest into legal settlement, achieved through representative institutions. The invitation itself establishes important precedent. Monarchical authority derives not from divine appointment alone, but from parliamentary consent that can impose conditions on royal power, while preserving traditional forms that provide psychological satisfaction for subjects weary of republican experimentation. The collapse of the Protectorate represents more than military failure or political miscalculation. It demonstrates the fundamental impossibility of sustaining revolutionary government without either genuine popular support or effective institutional arrangements that transcend individual leadership. The experiment that had begun with high hopes for godly reformation and democratic participation ends in military dictatorship that commands neither religious authority nor civilian allegiance, leaving restoration as the only alternative to continued chaos. Yet the 20 years of republican rule have permanently altered English political consciousness in ways that monarchical restoration cannot entirely reverse. The experience of successful resistance to royal authority, participation in regicide, conquest of neighboring kingdoms, and creation of alternative governmental arrangements has educated thousands of ordinary citizens in political possibilities that traditional arrangements had discouraged them from imagining. These lessons, once learned, prove remarkably difficult to unlearn, even when immediate circumstances favor restoration of familiar institutions. The revolution ends not through decisive defeat, but through exhaustion and disillusionment that makes any alternative seem preferable to continued uncertainty. The Protectorate collapses because it has lost the support of every significant social group, while failing to create new institutions capable of commanding lasting allegiance. Its failure, however, does not negate the achievements that republican government had accomplished, or the precedents that revolutionary experience has established for future generations, who will face similar challenges to traditional authority. England prepares for restoration with mixture of relief and apprehension, grateful for the prospect of constitutional settlement, while uncertain about the stability of arrangements that depend on royal moderation and parliamentary cooperation. The king who returns in 1660 will govern a nation transformed by revolution, even if it chooses to restore traditional forms, ruling subjects who have learned that governmental authority depends ultimately on popular consent rather than divine appointment or hereditary succession. The crowds that line London's streets on May 29, 1660, to welcome Charles II home from exile seem to celebrate the end of revolution, yet they unknowingly witness its transformation into something far more enduring than temporary political arrangements. The restored monarch who waves from his carriage understands what his cheering subjects do not. He rules a fundamentally different England than the one his father had governed 20 years earlier. Behind the pageantry of restoration lies a constitutional settlement that embeds revolutionary principles so deeply within traditional forms that future generations will mistake evolution for continuity, change for conservation. The king who returns is himself a product of revolutionary education, his political sophistication honed by years of exile that taught him lessons about the practical limits of royal authority that his father's rigid principles had prevented him from learning. Where Charles I had insisted on divine right that brooked no earthly limitation, Charles II accepts parliamentary partnership that preserves monarchical dignity while acknowledging legislative supremacy in matters of taxation and law. The Restoration succeeds precisely because it represents accommodation rather than reaction, constitutional monarchy rather than absolute rule. The Declaration of Breda's promises, religious toleration, parliamentary consultation, legal amnesty, become the foundation stones of a new constitutional edifice that incorporates revolutionary achievements within traditional structures. The king who had witnessed his father's execution understands that successful monarchy depends on popular consent rather than divine appointment alone, that royal authority must serve national interests rather than personal preference, that government requires institutional cooperation rather than individual command. Yet the settlement that emerges over the following decades reveals how completely the revolutionary experience has transformed English political consciousness, even among those who claim to restore ancient arrangements. The Cavalier Parliament that assembles in 1661 speaks the language of traditional loyalty while implementing policies that would have horrified pre-war royalists. Members who denounce republican innovation nevertheless insist on parliamentary control over taxation, legislative oversight of executive actions, and institutional independence that makes royal government accountable to representative authority. The religious settlement demonstrates similar transformation disguised as restoration. The Church of England that re-emerges in 1662 bears little resemblance to the episcopal hierarchy that Archbishop Laud had attempted to impose during the 1630s. The Clarendon Code, despite its harsh provisions against nonconformist worship, implicitly acknowledges the religious pluralism that revolutionary toleration had created while establishing boundaries that contain rather than eliminate Protestant diversity. The very act of legislating religious uniformity admits governmental limitation that pre-war authorities had claimed to transcend. More significantly, the thousands of Puritan ministers ejected from their livings in 1662 do not simply disappear, but create alternative religious communities that embody democratic principles learned during the revolutionary decades. Independent congregations, Baptist assemblies, and Quaker meetings develop patterns of worship and governance that emphasize individual conscience and collective decision-making over hierarchical authority and prescribed ritual. These religious experiments preserve revolutionary insights about human equality and popular participation that political restoration has temporarily suppressed. The economic transformation proves equally irreversible, despite attempts to restore traditional commercial arrangements. The merchants who had financed parliamentary armies, the landowners who had purchased confiscated estates, the manufacturers who had supplied republican forces, all retained their positions while adapting to monarchical governance that cannot eliminate the social changes that warfare and revolution have created. The commercial networks developed during the Commonwealth period continue operating under royal authority, demonstrating that economic relationships transcend particular political arrangements. The Navigation Acts, first implemented by the Republican government and continued under Restoration, reveal how revolutionary policies become permanent features of English governance when they serve national interests that transcend partisan considerations. The Commonwealth's aggressive pursuit of commercial advantage through state power establishes precedents that monarchical government adopts and extends, transforming England into a commercial empire whose expansion depends on methods that Cromwell's regime had pioneered. The military changes prove perhaps most significant for England's future development. The professional army that had emerged from civil war fighting does not simply disband, but evolves into the foundation of English military power that will dominate European battlefields for the next century. The tactical innovations, organizational methods, and strategic thinking developed during the revolutionary period become permanent features of English military culture, while the officer corps that had learned warfare through Republican service continues serving under royal authority. The constitutional precedents established during 20 years of political experimentation cannot be erased, despite Restoration rhetoric that emphasizes continuity with pre-war arrangements. The principle that taxation requires parliamentary consent, firmly established through revolutionary resistance and Republican practice, becomes so fundamental to English governance that future monarchs never seriously challenge it. The idea that executive authority must operate within legal limitations, demonstrated through Cromwell's own submission to constitutional constraints, provides the foundation for limited government that absolute monarchy cannot restore. The social transformation proves equally durable, as the revolutionary decades have educated ordinary citizens in political possibilities that traditional deference had discouraged them from imagining. Yeoman farmers who had served in parliamentary armies retain their understanding that governmental authority depends on popular consent rather than inherited status. Artisans and merchants who had participated in radical religious congregations continue applying democratic principles to secular relationships, despite official disapproval of revolutionary enthusiasm. The intellectual revolution spreads far beyond England's boundaries, as continental observers struggle to understand the implications of successful resistance to absolute monarchy. The regicide that had shocked European courts demonstrates that even the most sacred traditional authorities can be challenged when they fail to serve the interests of those they claim to govern. Republican government, despite its ultimate failure, proves that alternative political arrangements remain possible when circumstances favor fundamental change. John Milton's political writings, composed during the revolutionary decades, provide theoretical justification for popular sovereignty and individual liberty that future generations will invoke when confronting similar challenges to established authority. His arguments about the relationship between governors and governed, the proper limits of governmental power, and the right of resistance to tyrannical rule become part of the intellectual arsenal that later revolutionaries will employ against their own oppressive governments. The religious toleration that revolutionary governments had implemented, however imperfectly, establishes precedents for individual conscience and denominational diversity that restore religious uniformity cannot entirely eliminate. The Baptist communities that flourish despite legal restrictions, the Quaker meetings that persist through persecution, the independent congregations that maintain alternative forms of worship, all preserve revolutionary insights about spiritual freedom that will influence future struggles for religious liberty. The democratic experiments conducted in army councils and radical congregations provide practical experience of popular participation that traditional hierarchies cannot entirely suppress. The leveler arguments about political equality, the Digger experiments in economic cooperation, the fifth monarchist expectations of social transformation, all contribute to a repertoire of revolutionary ideas that remain available for future movements seeking to challenge established arrangements. The American colonies, settled largely during and after the English Revolutionary period, become laboratories where English revolutionary principles can develop without the constraints that Restoration has imposed on domestic experimentation. The Puritan communities of New England, the Quaker settlements of Pennsylvania, the commercial societies of the Chesapeake, all embody different aspects of revolutionary achievement while adapting English innovations to American circumstances. When American colonists resist British taxation in the 1760s and 1770s, they invoke principles and precedents that the English Civil War had established. No taxation without representation. The right of resistance to tyrannical government. The sovereignty of representative assemblies over executive authority. The arguments that justify American independence draw heavily on theoretical foundations that English revolutionaries had developed during their own struggles against arbitrary power. The French Revolution of 1789 explicitly acknowledges its debt to English precedents, while attempting to carry revolutionary logic further than English circumstances had permitted. The execution of Louis XVI consciously follows the example of Charles V's Regicide, while the establishment of republican government draws on both the theoretical arguments and practical experience that English revolutionaries had provided. The rights of man that French revolutionaries proclaim echo the natural law arguments that English levelers had advanced during the Putney debates. Yet the French experience also demonstrates the limitations and dangers that English revolutionary history had revealed. The terror that consumes the French Revolution reflects the same military necessity and ideological extremism that had characterized the final years of the English Commonwealth, while the eventual emergence of Napoleonic dictatorship parallels the Protectorate's dependence on individual authority rather than institutional legitimacy. The European revolutions of 1848 draw inspiration from both English and French examples, while confronting similar challenges of transforming revolutionary enthusiasm into stable governmental arrangements. The parliamentary systems that emerge from these struggles consciously adopt English constitutional principles, while avoiding the religious extremism and military dictatorship that had characterized the 17th century experience. The English working class movements of the 19th century explicitly trace their lineage to leveler democracy and digger communism, finding in revolutionary precedents the theoretical justification for popular participation and economic equality that industrial capitalism denies. Chartist demands for universal suffrage, secret ballot, and annual parliaments consciously invoke the agreement of the people, while adapting 17th century democratic theory to 19th century conditions. The abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire draws on arguments about natural rights and human equality that English revolutionaries had developed, though without fully implementing them. The evangelical Christianity that motivates anti-slavery activism explicitly connects with the Puritan tradition that had emerged from revolutionary religious experimentation, while the political methods employed by abolitionists reflect organizational techniques that radical congregations had pioneered. The women's suffrage movement similarly draws on revolutionary precedents about individual conscience and political participation, while extending these principles to groups that 17th century revolutionaries had not fully included. The arguments for sexual equality that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries consciously build on foundations that earlier struggles for religious and political liberty had established. The democratization of education, religion, and economic opportunity that characterizes modern British development reflects the long-term working out of principles that the Civil War had introduced into English political culture. The comprehensive schools that replace aristocratic privilege, the religious freedom that allows denominational diversity, the social mobility that rewards merit rather than birth, all embody revolutionary achievements that Restoration had modified but not eliminated. The development of the British Commonwealth as an association of self-governing nations, rather than a centralized empire, reflects lessons about the impossibility of governing diverse populations through uniform institutions that the revolutionary period had taught. The voluntary cooperation that characterizes Commonwealth relationships consciously avoids the imperial domination that had triggered American resistance while preserving beneficial connections that serve mutual interests. Even the constitutional monarchy that survives into the 21st century embodies revolutionary principles so completely that its traditional forms disguise radical content. The monarch who reigns but does not rule exercises authority that depends entirely on popular consent, mediated through representative institutions, while the ceremonies that preserve royal dignity serve democratic functions that revolutionary republicans had never anticipated. The House of Lords that continues as part of the British legislative system bears no resemblance to the hereditary aristocracy that the Commonwealth had abolished. Its membership now including life peers whose appointments reflect merit and public service rather than inherited status. The bishops who sit in the Lords represent religious authority that operates within pluralistic arrangements that revolutionary toleration had established, while the remaining hereditary peers exercise ceremonial functions that acknowledge traditional forms without conferring real power. The House of Commons that governs contemporary Britain embodies popular sovereignty so completely that its members wield authority that 17th century revolutionaries could hardly have imagined. The principle that governments derive their legitimacy from electoral mandate, established through revolutionary precedent and confirmed by Restoration practice, provides the foundation for democratic accountability that makes British governance responsive to popular will. The judicial independence that protects individual rights against governmental oppression reflects revolutionary insights about the rule of law that transcends particular political arrangements. The courts that can declare governmental actions illegal, the juries that can nullify prosecutions, the legal protections that shield individual conscience from state interference, all preserve revolutionary achievements within institutional forms that provide stability and continuity. The religious freedom that allows denominational diversity within a broadly Christian culture demonstrates how revolutionary toleration evolved into principled pluralism that serves social peace while protecting individual conscience. The establishment that maintains symbolic Anglican authority while permitting practical religious equality reflects accommodation between traditional forms and revolutionary substance that characterizes the broader constitutional settlement. The economic development that transformed Britain into the world's first industrial society builds directly on commercial and financial innovations that the revolutionary period had encouraged. The banking system that finances global trade, the manufacturing techniques that revolutionize production, the transportation networks that connect distant markets, all develop from foundations that Republican government had established while pursuing national economic advantage. The global influence that British institutions, language, and culture exercise throughout the modern world reflects the power of revolutionary ideas that transcended their original political context to become universal principles applicable to diverse circumstances. The parliamentary systems that former colonies adopt, the common law traditions that provide legal frameworks for emerging nations, the commercial practices that facilitate international trade, all embody achievements that the English Civil War had made possible. As evening settles over the contemporary British landscape, the revolution that began with resistance to ship money and ended with Republican collapse continues working its transformations through institutional arrangements that preserve its essential insights while adapting them to changing circumstances. The parliamentary democracy that governs modern Britain, the individual liberties that protect personal conscience, the economic freedoms that reward merit and effort, the religious toleration that accommodates diverse beliefs, all represent the continuing legacy of choices made by ordinary people who decided that some principles matter more than personal safety or social convention. The English Civil War ends not with restoration, but with permanent transformation, disguised as continuity, revolutionary achievement embedded within traditional forms, radical principles operating through familiar institutions. Its legacy lives on in every democratic society that recognizes popular sovereignty, every constitution that limits governmental power, every legal system that protects individual rights against arbitrary authority. The revolution succeeds ultimately not through military victory or political domination, but through the education it provides about human possibilities and governmental limitations. Once people learn that authority depends on consent rather than tradition, that institutions can be changed when they fail to serve human purposes, that ordinary citizens possess the capacity for political participation and moral judgment, these lessons prove remarkably difficult to unlearn, even when immediate circumstances favor restoration of traditional arrangements. The sleep that settles over England on this quiet evening carries dreams of futures that 17th century revolutionaries could never have imagined, but that their struggles made possible. The liberty they fought to establish, the equality they proclaimed in theory, the justice they sought through political action, all continue working their transformations through processes that transcend individual lives, while honoring the sacrifices that made progress possible. The revolution continues, patient and persistent, shaping human affairs through principles that prove more durable than the particular political arrangements that first gave them expression.